Accepted into the Martial Arts Association, hunters needed at least 100 vitality points and a minimum of 1,000 combat power. I broke the association's testing machine with one easy swing of my fist, tripling the required amount using only 50% of my ability. Even the association's top president couldn't help wanting to recruit me directly under her. She decided to test my magic attributes, explaining the 6 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, earth, thunder, and wind, and how compatibility with each element varied from person to person. To her shock, I had 100% fire attribute. Even she, a top 5-tier martial artist, only sat at 80% compatibility with fire. The orb glowed again, showing 100% compatibility with thunder, then 100% with wind. To her shock, I had 100% compatibility with every element. Realizing I wasn't an ordinary genius, she told me about the Great War approaching between the 10,000 races and humanity, and explained that because of this, the nation had invested all its resources into forming a training camp exclusively for geniuses like me. The information came flooding in all at once. Just a while ago, in my own training, I had broken through to the micro level, having originally believed there were only 5 stages of mastery in martial arts: basic, proficient, micro, mastered, and perfect. My friend praised me, saying that when it came to the Vajra fist, I was second to none. As we sparred and continued our training, he suddenly panicked and said he needed to head home. Greeting Teacher Lee on his way out, Teacher Lee approached me and asked if I planned to apply for the martial arts department, reminding me that the 30,000 win registration fee was due by Monday. I asked if he could extend the deadline, but he refused. I stayed behind after training, continuing to swing my fist and falling into thought. I remembered that my parents had died in a beast wave attack when I was 3 years old. I had been living with my relatives ever since, and once they learned I had talent for martial arts, they supported my training. In an era when ferocious beasts ran rampant, being a martial artist was an extremely high-income profession. I had decided to pursue this path to give them a good life, but now I was only making things harder for them. When I arrived home, I overheard my uncle and aunt talking, debating whether they could afford my registration fee. They agreed I had real talent and would amount to something in the future. My uncle then decided to stop his medication to save more money. Hearing this, I was filled with regret, but I forced myself to push past it. I went inside and greeted them. My aunt looked worried, and I took the bandages from her to change my uncle's dressing myself, though she insisted on doing it. Afterward, I went to my room, unable to sleep, determined to solve my problem the only way I knew how. The next day, I went to the underground martial arena. Nikki introduced me to the crowd, explaining that if I could win 4 consecutive matches, I would receive 60,000 yen in prize money. The audience murmured, saying they had never seen me before and wondering if I was looking to die. The girl quickly told me to hype up the crowd. I had no idea what she meant until she explained it was something like what they did in WWE.
The hostile takeover of Donald Trump!
And once I understood, I screamed to the crowd that anyone below the rank of martial artist stood no chance against me, daring the weaklings to step up and fight me. The crowd erupted with excitement. Even behind my mask, I could feel the killing intent directed at me, but this was the only way to make quick money. A man with a rabbit mask stepped into the ring. Watching him, I could tell he had strong momentum, but his lower body stance was unstable. As he charged to strike first, I calmly prepared my counter. Using the floating light palm, I sent him flying out of the ring, then called for the next opponent. The crowd erupted in shock. A man wearing what looked like a Rey Mysterio mask stepped forward and told me my luck ended here. Looking him over, I judged his strength to be average and decided to test my Vajra fist on him. He lunged at me, and I met his strike with my own fist. He couldn't believe the force behind it, though I knew his strength wasn't close to mine. I followed with a strike straight to his face. He overcommitted, leaving his waist exposed, so I drove a kick into his side and launched him clean out of the arena. I called for the next challenger. Nearby, the arena owner watched in surprise. I wasn't even a quasi-martial artist yet, but my strength clearly exceeded the average. Someone like me would be valuable for matchmaking. His junior, wearing a fox mask, offered to go recruit Su Hong, and the owner warned him not to reveal that I had already advanced to true martial practitioner. Meanwhile, I was already imagining myself holding the 60,000 yen in my hands. Just then, the fox-masked junior, known to the crowd as White Fox, stepped into the arena, and everyone was stunned. When I heard that the man in the fox mask was a quasi-martial practitioner, I realized this was going to be a tough fight, but I wasn't ready to lose. White Fox noticed the uneasiness on my face and told me to relax, assuring me he would go easy on me. The referee started the match, and since I could sense I was inferior to him, I decided to go all out from the beginning. Our fists met halfway, and the force behind his punch told me immediately that I was wrong about him. He wasn't a quasi-martial practitioner at all, but a genuine martial practitioner who had deliberately suppressed his vital blood energy. And before I even understood what was happening, he sent me flying with his Thunder Rush fist, a triple resonance technique. I crashed to the ground, my body ravaged by the attack. The crowd was stunned, certain I was finished. The fight continued, and I was forced onto the defensive. White Fox kept taunting me, telling me to show my true strength because I looked weak. I couldn't even move from where I lay, and I knew that if this continued, I was dead. I searched for an opening, but he landed a punch straight to my face that sent me flying again. I crashed to the ground, my face disfigured, and felt myself slowly losing consciousness. He placed his foot on me and said that if I kept this up, I would lose the prize money I'd been promised. Then he told me he had an offer instead. Join them, start throwing matches, and collect the full prize money each time. I told him confidently that I wasn't interested in something so shameless. His tone and expression shifted, and he warned me to reconsider, saying I couldn't refuse them. I told him that people like him should be ashamed to call themselves martial practitioners, pulling a stunt as trash as this. Since I refused his offer, he told me he would render me useless so I could never practice martial arts again. He threw a kick at me, but the moment I understood the weight of what he'd said, I pulled myself together and dodged it. I forced myself back onto my feet, driven by the determination that I couldn't afford to fail. He looked surprised that I could still stand after taking the full force of his Thunder Rush fist. What he didn't know was that I was driven by the will to become a martial practitioner so my family could live a good life. I wasn't someone who would build my future on something so shameful. Suddenly, a status window appeared in front of me, and a system voice asked what I was willing to give for my family. Without hesitation, I answered that I would give everything. An overwhelming aura swirled around my body, and I found myself pulled into a strange space. A giant golden figure stood before me and told me he was going to give me a chance. A golden status window appeared, displaying my stats and techniques. I wondered if it was a touchscreen and confirmed it was the moment I touched it. I opened the task section and found one labeled Path of the Arena. I was expected to hone my martial arts within that space before returning to deal with White Fox. Since this was the newbie tutorial, I was told there would be no reward for completing it. As I wondered what the task actually involved, a clone of myself appeared behind me and threw a punch at my head. I barely dodged it, realizing my clone was using the exact same skill I used. Since I now had a worthy opponent and an example to learn from, I decided to throw everything into it. I went after my clone, but it easily dodged my strike and landed a counterattack that knocked me backward. Suddenly, I noticed my technique's mastery had risen to 10%. Up from 7% before the duel began. That was when I understood the simple truth. Training against my own clone was helping me master the technique faster. I dashed toward it and we exchanged blows, each punch pushing my mastery higher. Before long, I had mastered a string of techniques just from sparring with myself and taking my own beating. After a rigorous session, I received a congratulatory message from the system telling me I had completed the task. When it asked if I wanted to return to reality, I said yes. Back in the real world, White Fox assumed I was just playing around, acting cool and mysterious. He lunged at me, swinging a punch at my face, but all he caught was my afterimage. I dodged his attack with ease and told him he was too slow. The next thing he knew, a punch was already on its way to his face, shattering his mask and rearranging his facial bones. One punch was enough to knock him to the ground, and the crowd went wild. I turned to the hostess and asked when I'd be getting my money, since I had just won my 4th match. The hostess was completely startled by what she had just witnessed, and she took a moment before announcing me as the winner, revealing that I would receive the 60,000 yuan reward. The owner of the establishment was stunned by what he had seen, left wondering how a martial apprentice could already master the Balsher fist technique. He instructed 2 of his men to follow me so they could find out who I really was. On my way home, I quickly realized I was being followed, and I wasted no time slipping into a maneuver that threw them off my trail. They were left wondering where I had disappeared to, never realizing I was hanging right above them the whole time. An hour later, I returned home and handed my guardians the money I had earned. They were shocked and asked where it had come from. I lied, telling them I had earned it as a sparring partner at the dojo where I worked, adding that the dojo had decided to sponsor my training because of my talent. My uncle was surprised to hear this, since he had once complained about how stingy the dojo was. I calmed them both down, asking if they didn't trust me, and they quickly came to their senses, agreeing that I would never lie to them. Later that night, I went up to the roof to reflect on how well the day had gone. I'd sorted out my registration fee for the martial arts examination, covered my rent, and even taken care of part of my aunt's medical bills. I was relieved that the system had helped me turn danger into safety, but I noticed that aside from my technique levels, none of my other stats had changed. I saw something labeled Martial Dao Value and had no idea what it did. The system explained that defeating an opponent above my level had earned me 67 martial Dao value points, which could be used to increase vital blood or martial techniques, and advised me to spend them wisely. I decided to try it immediately and put everything into vital blood. The effect showed on my body right away. My vital blood jumped to 90, and I realized I had reached the quasi-martial practitioner level. With all my points poured into it, I felt a clear increase in physical strength, and most of my injuries had already healed. Sensing this overwhelming new power in my body, I figured the best way to test it was somewhere safe, so I headed to my school's martial training ground, where a combat power tester was located. Moments later, I arrived at Star City No. 1 High School's training field, where the device sat waiting. It turned out to be only a Tier 1 combat tester. I decided to use just 70% of my punch power to try it out. I took a deep breath and struck the device only to watch in dismay as it shattered completely. I knew I'd be in serious trouble if anyone found out I was the one who destroyed it. Just then, I heard someone approaching, drawn by the noise. It was the principal, and the old man nearly lost his mind when he saw the school's testers smashed to pieces. He immediately concluded it had to be the work of the school's two resident geniuses, Chen Shan and Li Tu, and decided he would teach them both a lesson the moment school resumed. The next day, all the students at Star City assembled in the gymnasium. I wondered why Chen Shan looked so beaten up, and someone mentioned hearing that he had broken the tester during an outdoor drill in the middle of the night and refused to admit it. I figured they had just made him take the blame. The principal told everyone to settle down, then introduced his comrade, a Tier 3 martial artist named Chan Tien, who was there to teach a kink martial art called the Thunder Rush Fist. The students were surprised, recalling that this same technique cost hundreds of thousands to learn elsewhere. I realized there was also the exact technique the fox-masked man had used against me, and I knew I had to seize this opportunity, since registering to learn it outside would cost me several $100,000 on my own. Chan Tien told us that how much we learned depended entirely on our will, then shifted his stance and began explaining the levels of the Thunder Rush Fist. Each punch produced one thunderous boom at the basic level, 3 resonances at mastery, 5 at minute subtlety, and 7 at greater mastery, which was his own current level. If perfected, he said, the technique could produce 9 resonances. He told us not to rush, since even reaching the beginner level that day would be enough. He then demonstrated the technique a second time, instructing us to follow his lead. Hours later, the other students were already exhausted and no one had managed to grasp it. I had quietly slipped out of the hall by then, and my friend wondered where I had disappeared to. Eventually, Chen Shan reached the beginner level, the only student among them to do so, further cementing his reputation as the school's genius. The principal excitedly pointed this out to the trainer and asked if he would consider giving Chen Shan some personal guidance. The trainer, however, looked unimpressed, telling the principal that Chen Shan was average at best. Afterward, away from the crowd, Shan Tian told the old man that this year's batch was unimpressive and that he had been embarrassed for nothing. The principal, addressed as Li, told him he should be grateful to have even one student reach the beginner level, since finding a true top-tier genius was nearly impossible. The trainer replied that martial cultivation was harsh and talent mattered above everything else. Li agreed, admitting that effort alone, without natural gift, was rarely enough. Just then, they noticed a student practicing alone on the school field. His back was turned, so they didn't recognize him, but right in front of them, I executed the 7 resonance Thunder Rush Fist, and they were stunned. The trainer asked Li who the student was, but Li had no idea he had someone that talented in his school. They were even more shocked to realize I had reached greater mastery, the same level the trainer had only just demonstrated hours earlier. Li then noticed the trainer standing frozen, as if working something out, and asked what was wrong. The trainer suddenly declared that he finally understood what he needed to do. He clenched his fist and threw a punch that activated 8 resonances, shocking Li completely. Li couldn't believe the trainer had broken through right there on the spot, and the trainer admitted that watching me had given him the inspiration, confessing he might never have broken through without that spark. He suggested they skip the conversation and find out who the student was. They rushed onto the field, but by the time they got there, I had already vanished. As I walked away from the school, I marveled at how exhausting it was to cultivate a C-crank technique. Since my Thunder Rush Fist had already reached perfection, I realized I needed to find a way to earn martial Dao value quickly if I wanted to break through to martial practitioner. I wondered whether sparring with someone would earn me points instead of having to risk my life in a true life or death fight. Later, I arrived at Thunder Dojo, where I worked part-time. As I walked in, my friend asked why I had come that day, and I told him I just wanted to get some practice in. Meanwhile, a purple-haired student was in the middle of arguing with another student. I asked my friend what the issue was, and he explained that the new instructor was this purple-haired student's personal teacher. The instructor himself was strong, but he looked down on commoners as if they weren't even human. The purple-haired student, Leon, was strong in his own right and was about to beat up the student he was arguing with when I grabbed his arm and told him to calm down. Lion was furious that some random guy had grabbed him and demanded to know who I was, telling me to fight him one-on-one in the arena if I thought I was a big shot. I accepted without hesitation, but the instructor walked in at that exact moment and cut everything short, telling us to get ready for class. Lion taunted me, saying I had simply gotten lucky. The instructor then announced that it was his last day teaching us the furious sea spear art, and that, as always, he would only demonstrate it once. Deep down, he expected none of us to actually learn it, since he believed we were all hopeless. True to his word, he demonstrated the move a single time, but I managed to lock the entire sequence into my memory. He walked off afterward, telling us the rest was up to us, which made the other students protest loudly that he had only shown it once. While they argued, I tried out what I had just memorized, and to everyone's shock, I picked it up almost perfectly. My classmates were stunned, left wondering if they were simply too slow to learn it themselves. Just then, Leon walked back in, having heard the commotion from the other room. He was surprised to see that I had actually learned the technique and decided he needed to test how deep my skill really went if I was truly a genius. He called my name and offered to give me some pointers on the spear art. I agreed, which worried my friend who warned me that despite his arrogance, Leon was genuinely strong. I told him not to worry about me. I leveled my spear at Leon and taunted him, which only made him angrier at my confidence. He charged at me using his technique. I simply sighed and performed the exact same move back at him, and he was furious that I had used his own technique against him. I met him halfway with a technique of my own that matched his. Lion was left in shock, wondering how I had managed to cultivate the skill to mastery so fast, despite not even being a martial practitioner yet. We kept swinging at each other, and I slipped into a flow state until I finally smashed his spear clean out of his hand. The system immediately informed me that I had earned 35 points for defeating an opponent above my level. I was pleased to see this, since it confirmed exactly what I'd suspected. Normal sparring could earn me points too, which meant I could simply keep sparring with more people to build them up. Lion, meanwhile, was on his knees, unable to accept that he had just lost to someone he considered trash. Refusing to accept defeat, he got back on his feet and charged at me with a punch, but the instructor stepped in just in time to stop the fight. He walked up to Lion and struck him across the face, telling him he couldn't truly call himself a martial practitioner until he learned how to face failure. Lion couldn't believe he had just been scolded by his own master because of me. Deep down, the instructor was genuinely curious how I had reached mastery from watching his demonstration only once. He knew that even the geniuses in the capital would have struggled to do what I had just done. He recognized that Leon was talented but far too arrogant, and believed that being humbled by me would teach him some manners. Then turned and apologized to me himself, saying it was his own fault for not teaching Leon properly. I could hardly believe how quickly his tone had shifted. That night, I headed home, checking over the rewards I had earned from the spar and the lesson along the way. Despite my exhaustion, I was grateful for what I'd gained. I remembered that the school exam was only a few days away, and that students with money had already prepared high-grade alloy weapons, which meant I needed a weapon of my own too. Since the spear I had used felt comfortable in my hands, I decided to commit to spears and concluded I would need to buy an alloy one. The problem was that I barely had enough money for that, let alone enough to cover my aunt's treatment. As I racked my brain for another way to make money, I noticed an important news bulletin flash across the screen. The city lord was recruiting martial practitioners due to the rising number of ferocious beasts. I immediately added this to my list of priorities. When I got home, I jumped straight into helping my aunt with her chores, placing massage plasters on my uncle's back and telling him not to overwork himself now that I could earn money for the family. He admitted that would be nice, but said he couldn't sit idle, assuring me he was only doing light work to cover daily expenses. My aunt reminded me that I would need a large sum of money for my martial arts training later, which was why they wanted to save as much as possible for me. I realized then that my uncle and aunt simply wouldn't rest, having grown too used to hard living, and that the only real solution was to earn an overwhelming amount of money so they would no longer feel the need to work themselves into the ground. This only strengthened my resolve to earn money from hunting ferocious beasts. Knowing the wilderness was dangerous, I figured I needed to raise my strength as much as possible beforehand, so I put all my remaining martial Dao points into vital blood. Once added, my vital blood shot up to 95.2, just a single step away from becoming a true martial practitioner. After 2 full days of intense training, I managed to bring all my martial techniques to perfection. With my preparations complete, I decided it was time to leave the city and hunt. That Saturday, I made my way to the Star City Martial Practitioner Base. Since it was my first time there, I was surprised by how far it actually was. Once inside, I realized the base was filled with martial practitioners, the kind you didn't see just anywhere. I picked up a manual and learned how points were awarded for each ferocious beast killed, ranked from Tier 1 early stage down to the late stage. To count as a verified kill, a hunter had to cut off the beast's left ear as proof. While looking around, I noticed a group entering the base. The largest man among them carried a bag clearly stuffed with severed ears, and their arrival drew everyone's attention. Leading the group was a blonde-haired man named Ya. Something about his aura and his outfit struck me as familiar, and I realized he was White Fox from the underground arena. It turned out the other practitioners didn't think much of him, and most would have beaten him senseless already if his uncle weren't the base manager. You noticed me standing in the distance, and our eyes locked. I realized then that I had to worry about dangerous people just as much as dangerous beasts. Once I finished settling my affairs, I told the official I would be heading out alone. He assumed I was simply trying to prove how tough I was and would likely die out there. As I stepped into the woods, I made up my mind to return with a bag full of monster ears. 2 hours later, I was already growing frustrated, having walked the area without spotting a single beast. Since the outskirts had turned up nothing, I decided to push deeper into the forest. I hadn't gone far when I came across a phantom moonwolf, a tier 1 early-stage ferocious beast. It was my first time seeing one in the flesh, and it wasted no time leaping toward me, clearly intent on tearing me apart. As it lunged at me with claws bared, I reacted in a split second, sidestepping the attack and driving a lightning-charged punch straight into its gut. The impact sent the beast flying, its massive body slamming into a tree with a heavy thud. It slumped to the ground, paralyzed. Looking down at my trembling hands, I felt the power surging through me. Fighting real, ferocious beasts was far more thrilling than I had imagined. Dropping a tier 1 early-stage beast in a single hit got my blood pumping, and I found myself wondering how I'd handle something from the mid-stage if this was already so easy. Just then, I sensed movement. It was a raging black bear, a tier 1 mid-stage beast, and it charged immediately. Before it could strike, I closed the distance in a blur and slammed a lightning-infused fist straight into it, dropping it instantly. Exhaling slowly, I realized just how powerful I had become. Unless I ran into a tier 2 beast, I was safe here, and that meant another 3,000 secured in bounty. Suddenly, a system notification appeared. My accumulated martial value was finally enough to break through and become a martial artist. A terrifying roar shook the forest. I turned toward the sound, narrowing my eyes. Curiosity and caution fought inside me, but curiosity won, and I moved quietly toward the source. What I saw made me hold my breath. A colossal black-scaled serpent was coiled among the trees, a tier 1 late-stage beast known as a black jade python. A group of fighters nearby was struggling against it, clearly losing, getting tossed aside one after another, completely overpowered. My heart pounded as I watched. This was an entirely different level of threat. I suddenly leaped to dodge one of the snake's attacks, but it caught me with another strike while I was still in the air, sending me flying. I coughed up blood, and as I landed, I noticed a corpse lying beside me. I wiped the blood from my mouth and grabbed the dead man's spear, turning to face the giant python as it lunged at me again. I dodged. A tier 1 late-stage ferocious beast like this normally required an entire team of martial artists to bring down, but since all my martial techniques had already reached perfection, I decided this was the moment to test exactly what I was capable of. I used the Furious Sea Spear art at full perfection, driving the spear straight through its body, and it screamed in pain. I leaped toward where my weapon had landed, retrieved it, and readied myself to strike again, determined to repeat the attack as many times as it took. I performed the technique a second time, and the spear pierced through its flesh once more. I kept going, pulling the spear free each time, fully aware that the difference in size between us was like comparing day and night. All I could realistically do was wear it down as much as possible before going for the finishing blow. Caught off guard, the python lashed out with its tail, but I met it with a perfected Thunder Rush fist before quickly retrieving my spear and searching for the next opening. This fighting style was exhausting to maintain, but I wasn't the only one running low. The python itself was nearing its limit as well. Just as I prepared to go in for another strike, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning, I saw the large man from earlier, already airborne, fist swinging down at me. I blocked it, but the force still sent me staggering back, my whole body trembling from the impact. I demanded to know who they were, and that was when the fox-masked man and his crew revealed themselves, telling me I should leave this prey for him instead. I found myself surrounded by a large group of men who had a history of bad blood with me. Their leader mocked me, saying that when he'd seen me leave the city alone, he'd been certain I would die out here. He admitted he hadn't expected me to have such good luck, not only surviving but managing to land a heavily injured black jade giant python in the process. I realized that since he claimed to have just found the python, they must have only just arrived, and counted 5 of them total, all martial artists. With the numbers stacked against me, I knew I couldn't take them all head on. I was still working out my next move when the big guy lunged at me again, screaming for me to get lost. That was the moment my patience ran out. I snapped back at him, telling him I'd only knocked him down earlier because his attack had caught me off guard. I met him halfway with a real punch this time, and before he could even react, my fist connected with his head and dropped him flat, taking him out of the fight entirely. Watching that, Ya immediately put it together. I was the Minotaur fighter from the underground arena, the first person to ever humiliate him in front of a crowd. He ordered his men to kill me on the spot. I grabbed my spear and bolted into the forest. They chased after me, but the dense trees gave me enough cover to disappear, though none of them seemed particularly worried, since I was still just one guy against 5. I didn't stay hidden for long. I appeared out of nowhere and slammed the masked one straight into the ground before he even registered what had happened, then vanished again just as fast. Ya admitted grudgingly that I was quick. His remaining men were starting to get nervous, recognizing that whatever technique I was using wasn't something to take lightly, but Ya barked at them to keep their mouths shut. From up in a tree, I took stock. If the python hadn't already drained most of my stamina, I could have taken all of them head on without much trouble. As it stood, picking them off one by one was my safer option. I dropped from the branch and tossed my spear off to the side to pull their attention, and the second they turned to look, I went after the one with the nice haircut and kicked him square in the head, knocking him out cold. That left the last lackey screaming like a child, begging Ya that they should just run because I was clearly too strong. Ye refused, insisting he had to kill me that day no matter what. Before the last guy could process anything, I appeared behind him the same way as before and put him on the ground, leaving Ya standing there alone, the only one left on his feet, and from the look on his face, probably regretting most of his recent decisions. At that point, Ya was visibly panicking, trying to figure out how I'd gotten this strong in only a few days. Since he was the last one standing, I decided to have a little fun with him. I ran past him, and by the time he spun around, I was already gone. I reappeared right behind him, but this time he managed to react, snapping at me not to get overconfident, convinced he had me cornered. He fired an energy blast straight from his finger, which I barely dodged, the blast missing my head by inches and obliterating the tree behind me instead. He kept firing, using a skill he called the void-breaking finger, forcing me to keep relocating. The power behind it was enough that I started wondering if it was actually a B-rank technique. Then Ye made the mistake of running his mouth. Not content with bragging, he threatened to have my family killed once he got back to the city. That was the line he shouldn't have crossed. Something in me snapped, fear included, and I went straight for him. He was still mid-boast about his connections when I appeared behind him and drove a punch into his head, telling him I'd honestly liked him better when he was just arrogant. The hit nearly twisted his head clean off his shoulders, sending him flying into a wall. I probably looked like something out of a nightmare walking toward him after that, telling him he should have left my family out of it entirely. Blood pouring out of him, he asked how I'd possibly gotten this strong, insisting it should have been impossible. He was still asking dumb questions when the black python reappeared behind him and slammed him into the ground with its tail. I realized a little late that I'd spent way too long dealing with Ya, and that delay had given the snake exactly the time it needed to recover. Meanwhile, Ya's lackeys had regained consciousness, and while they were still trying to figure out where Ya had gone, they spotted me running straight toward them. Just as they braced to fight, I screamed at them to get out of the way. It dawned on them a second too late that I was being chased by the black python. I sprinted past them, but they weren't fast enough, and the python took them out where they stood. Surprisingly, the system credited me with points for indirectly killing them too. I was honestly shocked that it counted that way, and it reminded me that I now had more than enough points to finally break through and become a true martial practitioner. I spotted a cave in the distance and made for it without hesitation, slipping inside just before the snake could catch up. It tried desperately to force its way in after me, but as it struggled, I pulled up my status window and started pouring points into vital blood as fast as I could. The process was agonizing, like lava running through my veins, but I pushed through it. By the time I finished, I had become a true martial practitioner, a red aura swirling around my body. The python seemed to sense the change immediately and started backing away from the cave entrance. I wasn't about to let it go. I went after it, landing a punch to its head that sent it flying, and it began bleeding heavily, though I wasn't finished. I leapt toward it, drove a punch into its body, then forced my spear deep into its flesh, using enough strength to pin it to the ground. With it held in place, I unleashed the Thunder Rush fist directly onto its head, without mercy, and the force of the blow crushed its skull completely. That single kill earned me 92 Dao points. When it came time to take proof of the kill, I realized I had a problem. Snakes don't have ears. Still, getting back to the base mattered more than figuring that out. As I turned to leave, I found Ye's crushed body lying nearby. I told him he should be grateful he died the way he did, since I'd honestly had worse plans for him. I searched his body, hoping to recover the technique he'd been using, and found a manual for the void-breaking finger tucked away. That night, I locked myself in the cave to study and master it. Once I felt ready, I summoned my clone, and the two of us fought it out as I worked to internalize the skill. After a brutal session, I finally broke through to the beginner level. By the time I returned to reality, I noticed blood dripping from my nose, proof of just how demanding the technique really was. I decided to find something to test it on properly. 3 days later, I was still out hunting with my new skill. I fired off an energy blast into a charging brown bear, and it dropped instantly. Confident I had the technique under control, I decided it was finally time to head back to the base. At the counter, where everyone logs their kills, I dropped my bag, and the attendant began reading off the list of monsters I'd brought down, visibly stunned. By the time she finished, the total came to 46,000 points worth of kills. It was only then that it hit me. I'd gone a bit overboard, since I'd really only meant to hunt a handful. Just then, part of the base wall exploded inward. Everyone braced, confused that they were apparently under attack with so many practitioners standing right there. The one who'd smashed through turned out to be Ya's uncle, the base manager. He looked furious, and when the officials asked what was wrong, he announced that his nephew and the rest of his gang had all been killed. The crowd was shocked, though privately most of them weren't too broken up about it since Ya hadn't exactly been well liked. The old man added that a B-rank technique had gone missing from Ya's body and demanded everyone in the base be searched before anyone was allowed to leave. I kept my expression neutral, running through everything that had happened out in the woods, confident the deaths could be pinned on the python and not on me. Right as I was thinking that through, the old man's eyes suddenly locked onto mine. He walked over and told me he was already well aware of my latest feat, taking down beasts like they were nothing and racking up over 400,000 points in the process. One of old Ya's assistants told him she had checked my stats and that I barely qualified as tier 1 early stage, which meant there was no realistic way I could have killed that many beasts. She figured I had simply grabbed Ya's backpack and suggested they search me. 2 bodyguards approached with an intimidating air, telling me to cooperate. Just as they got close, I had my spear leveled at them before they even registered it. They demanded to know what I was trying to pull, and I told them plainly that I was a student at Star City No. 1 High School, then asked if they were really willing to search me knowing that. The moment old Ya heard that, he remembered exactly how fiercely the principal protected his students, and he knew better than to provoke that man over nothing. Privately, he considered that I might genuinely be some kind of genius if I really had taken down all those beasts myself, which meant falsely accusing me could backfire badly on him. He walked over and explained that Ya and his team had been ambushed, that a technique had been stolen from them, and that they needed to search me to confirm I wasn't involved. I decided to add a condition of my own. I told him that if they searched me and found nothing, he would owe me 30,000 wen for the trouble. I was confident there was nothing connecting me to what happened in the forest anyway. He agreed, and his men searched me thoroughly, turning up nothing. True to the deal, he had them hand over the 30,000. I was relieved everything had gone smoothly, helped along by the fact that I'd burned the technique manual before ever leaving the forest. Once the search was done, I left with my next move already planned. I headed to the inn at the martial practitioner base, and once I'd settled in, I decided to spend my points. I was honestly stunned by how many I had stockpiled. The problem was deciding where to put them, since I realized my mortal body and spirit attributes hadn't been touched since the very beginning. Curious, I dumped points into both, filling the mortal body first before pushing the rest into spirit. The change was immediate and intense enough that I could physically feel it happening. The spirit upgrade started reshaping me toward a far more muscular build, but I managed to dial the effect back in time. I was grateful I caught it, since there was no way I could have explained that transformation to anyone. An hour later, I made my way to the Star City Martial Practitioner Association. At the front desk, I told the attendant I was there for the Martial Practitioner assessment. She calmly informed me that a staff member would show me the way shortly, and sure enough, someone arrived to lead me to the testing section. The staff explained that passing the Tier 1 assessment required at least 100 vital blood and over 1,000 combat power. Most of the practitioners watching assumed I was just there for the experience. At the testing center, I watched a few candidates fail outright. One candidate, Li Ming, passed right in front of me with exactly 1,000 combat power. It turned out he was a student of Zhang Ming, who also happened to be Leon's instructor. Li Ming then turned to me with plenty of arrogance, telling me it was my turn, fully convinced I was about to embarrass myself. That confidence took a hit the moment I passed the vital blood test with 123 points. He recovered by reminding himself that I hadn't taken the combat power test yet, the part that actually mattered. I was led to the power testing machine, and I couldn't help remembering how I'd already broken one of these back at school. Knowing I was stronger now, I considered using just 40% of my power. But then it occurred to me that going too light and falling short of the requirement would be just as bad as overdoing it. So I settled on 50% instead to be safe. I drove my fist into the machine with enough force that it actually tore loose from its bolted base and slammed into the wall, leaving everyone watching in stunned silence. Lai Ming, arrogant only minutes earlier, looked like he couldn't process what he'd just seen. The machine's rated capacity was 3,000 combat power, and I had blown straight past it, leading the other practitioners to conclude I was some kind of monster.
That's what I'm talking about! That's why he's the MVP! That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
Meanwhile, the president of the Star City Martial Association, Wu Lingjin, was sitting in her office complaining about the lack of genuine talent coming through lately. Just then, an official burst into the room, telling her that some kind of monster had just shown up at the assessment center. Her mind immediately raced the moment she heard that the testing machine had been destroyed. I was directed to the Martial Artist Association's Central Hall. The staff member told me he would take me to register my identity, and as I thanked him, a voice called out saying she would handle me. It was the association president. She introduced herself and told me to follow her. I was surprised, since rumor had it she was a Tier 5 martial artist. We arrived at her office, where Wu mentioned that Lee had told her he had no geniuses at a school, a claim that had clearly turned out to be false. I asked her why she had brought me to her office, since I had only come to register as a martial practitioner, so I could collect my allowance and receive a guiding technique. Ru told me to relax, explaining that she had already instructed the staff to handle my martial practitioner certificate and monthly allowance. As for the guiding technique, she said she would teach me personally. She asked how much I already knew about guiding techniques, and I explained what I'd picked up from books. She told me the textbooks weren't entirely wrong, but that guiding techniques were far more than just cultivation methods. She used her own heavenly flame technique as an example, explaining that it absorbed fire attribute spiritual energy, strengthened the body, and imbued her attacks with destructive flame power. She added that if I could externalize an attribute, I could extend my attack range, though for a Tier 1 practitioner like me, simply carrying a trace of it was already impressive. I was genuinely shocked to learn guiding techniques could be used offensively. I had always assumed they were strictly for absorbing spiritual energy during cultivation. Woe continued that there were 7 spiritual energies in heaven and earth: metal, wood, water, fire, earth, thunder, and wind. Each had its own strengths and weaknesses, but in raw attack power, thunder ranked first, metal second, and fire third. She told me that the guiding technique I'd be able to cultivate depended entirely on my affinity, and I realized that meant I could effectively choose whichever one I wanted to pursue. Wu placed a large crystal ball on the table, explaining it was used to test affinity, and that the larger the glowing area, the higher the affinity. Ordinary practitioners usually scored below 30%. Wu herself sat at around 80%, which was considered exceptionally high, though she believed someone like me might exceed 90. I picked up the ball, aware that even reaching 90% would already put me above someone as talented as her. Then the ball lit up completely, glowing at full capacity. To her shock, I had 100% affinity for fire. She grabbed my arm and asked if I understood what that meant, so she explained that it meant I could absorb fire attribute spiritual energy with perfect efficiency and zero leakage. With her own 80% affinity, she was losing 20% of what she absorbed. And even with that limitation, she had still reached Tier 5 and become president of the Star City branch. She told me my achievements would inevitably surpass her own, confessing she never expected a place as rural as Star City to produce a genius like me. While she was still processing this, I was already thinking about the thunder attribute. Since I preferred it, I tried it, and the ball lit up completely again, maxing out just like it had for fire. Wu stood frozen, speechless, refusing to believe what she was seeing. She was still locked in disbelief over my having 100% affinity for 2 attributes, when I told her wind was also at 100%. Minutes later, she still couldn't move, completely overwhelmed by what she'd witnessed. A memory surfaced in her mind, a giant monster she'd once fought that had ravaged the city, and it occurred to her that defeating a threat that overwhelming would require someone with equally overwhelming power. She was still lost in thought when I pointed out that it would be a waste to cultivate only the thunder attribute while ignoring the rest. I asked her for advice on guiding techniques, and she told me that since everyone's energy was limited, it was best to focus on no more than 1 or 2. She mentioned that someone in the past had tried cultivating all 7 at once, but after decades of effort, they remained stuck at Tier 1. I told her I couldn't decide yet and wanted to try all of them first before settling on which to focus on. She agreed, but warned me not to waste my talent by spreading myself too thin. She then brought up the upcoming school exam. When I asked why it mattered, she explained that tensions on the myriad races battlefield had been escalating, and that war between the myriad races and humanity could break out at any moment. Because of this, every nation was pouring resources into genius training camps, and she had a recommendation slot she wanted to secure for me, on the condition that I took first place in my school's monthly exam. The weight of this hit me hard, since it was a myriad race war that had taken my parents' lives. I told her I would give everything I had, because I refused to let that tragedy repeat itself. I needed to grow stronger, both for myself and for the people around me. That night, I went home and told my aunt and uncle everything that had happened. They were overjoyed to hear how far I'd come. I explained that as a Tier 1 martial practitioner, I would now receive a 10,000 wen allowance every month, and told my uncle he no longer needed to work himself into the ground. He was relieved to hear it and told me that I was now the pillar of the family, and that whatever I decided, he would support. Later that night, I went up to the roof as usual to test out the fire attribute, managing to produce smoke, enough to count as beginner level in the guiding technique. A guiding technique section then appeared on my status window, confirming that I had indeed already learned it. I noticed it also had its own levels, which surprised me since Wu had never mentioned anything like that. It became clear that progressing through those levels was something only I could do through practice. I didn't know how leveling up actually worked. I wondered if martial Dao points could be used for that too, but since I had no clue, I decided to focus on cultivating the rest of the guiding techniques first. I sat down to work through them, but hours passed without progress, since all 7 attributes naturally repelled one another. I remembered the genius Wu had mentioned, the one who stayed stuck at Tier 1 for decades despite trying to cultivate all 7. Even though I had all 7 attributes inside me, I could only mobilize one at a time. Every time I tried forcing a second in alongside it, the two clashed violently and canceled each other out. Knowing thunder and fire shared some similarities, I decided to try cultivating them together. Hours went by without the result I wanted, and it carried on into the next day. But eventually, I managed to stabilize both thunder and fire at the same time. I created a fireball wrapped in lightning in my palm, and after a full night of effort, I felt genuinely proud that it had finally worked. I decided it was time to test the new power. I went to the test field to try it out on the Tier 3 Combat Power Tester. Since I had used 50% of my strength last time, I dialed it down to 30% this round. I punched the tester and the reading came back above 2,000, which made it clear just how much stronger I'd actually become. Curious, I decided to combine fire and thunder together and hit the machine again, and this time it broke completely. I realized then just how terrifying the power became once 2 abilities were fused, and I started wondering what would happen if I eventually mastered all 7. Back home, I tried fusing 3 attributes together, but it failed, proving even harder than the 2 attribute combination. I cycled through every combination I could think of without making any progress, and started wondering whether raising my guiding technique level might be the missing piece needed to fuse them successfully. With the monthly exam scheduled for the next day, I figured my best move was to earn as many martial Dao points as possible before then. The next day at school, Lee addressed the students, explaining that with tensions on the front lines rising, an annual training camp would now be held each year to select and intensively train geniuses. He mentioned the camps came with abundant resources, including pills and instruction from grandmasters. He revealed that only the top 3 students from the monthly exam would qualify for the Star City camp. The students were thrilled at the announcement, though I was more focused on the mention of a Tier 7 grandmaster. Just then, my friend told me that Lu and Chenshan had both become martial practitioners. I could hardly believe that in the 10 days I'd been gone, the 2 of them had already broken through. Apparently, the principal had brought in the instructor, Chen, to give them extra lessons during that time. My friend went on about everything impressive the 2 had accomplished, and now they were apparently competing to see who was actually the stronger of the pair. Meanwhile, the principal and Chen Tian were still trying to track down the mystery student from before, and having failed, had started assuming he must not even attend their school. Just then, Jiang Ming arrived with Leon and Li Ming in tow. He teased the principal, remarking that the quality of students that year didn't seem particularly impressive. When the principal asked what he wanted, Zhang explained he'd brought his 2 disciples to spar with the students, supposedly to teach them the proper way of doing things. The principal immediately saw through it as an attempt to humiliate him, but refusing the offer would amount to admitting his school had no real talent. While he was still weighing his options, Leon spotted me among the students in the distance and whispered it to Zhang. The moment Zhang turned and confirmed it was really me, he panicked, having never expected me to actually attend the #1 high school. He quickly decided it would be smarter to withdraw, since none of his disciples stood a chance against me. He brushed it off as a joke, telling the principal his own disciples couldn't compare to the caliber of students already at the school. Chen Tian and Li nearly lost their tempers hearing that, assuming Jiang was mocking them sarcastically. Shortly after, the exam began, and I was matched against a guy named Ping. Everyone assumed I was finished, since my first opponent was already a quasi-martial practitioner. He even taunted me, asking if I was ready to step down before he'd even finished his sentence. I'd already knocked him to the ground like it was nothing. The crowd was stunned, Watching me take down a quasi-martial practitioner in a single hit, people started wondering just how strong I really was, having made it all the way to the finals as a Tier 1 warrior. Even Zhang Ming asked the principal where I'd come from and how he had failed to notice me during training. The truth was, even the principal hadn't noticed me before. Chen Tian found me strangely familiar, as if he'd seen me somewhere before. But before he could place it, the principal mentioned that the semi-final match was about to wrap up, a fight between Chen Shan and Li Tu, the two of them locked in an even contest. As they fought, they kept trading taunts about who was truly the strongest in school and who deserved second place. Then Chen Shan externalized his attribute, wrapping flame around his fists, stunning the spectators, since fire ranked just below thunder in raw destructive power. Li Tu answered by externalizing his own attribute, metal, which actually surpassed fire in destructive capability, shocking the crowd even further. He pressed forward with fast, relentless attacks that left everyone watching in disbelief. Chen Shan clearly felt the force behind every strike, and the instructors realized Li Tu had been hiding his true strength all along, which explained how he managed to overpower Chen Shan so cleanly. Chen Tian praised him for mastering attribute externalization in only 10 days, on top of reaching minute subtlety. The principal concluded there was no point even watching the final, since with minute subtlety on his side, I wouldn't stand a chance against Li Tu. Chen Tian agreed, adding that I might have had a shot if I actually possessed a guiding technique. Just then, one of the instructors put 50,000 on me, and the principal happily accepted the bet. Soon after, Li Tu and I faced each other in the final. He taunted me, saying I'd only made it this far out of luck, since I'd avoided crossing paths with him or Chen Shan earlier. I stayed quiet, privately pleased to finally have a decent human opponent after spending so long fighting beasts. He told me I should feel proud just being able to call myself second best in the school for reaching the final. I asked him who exactly was first, and he lunged at me, declaring it was obviously him. He unleashed a 5-resonance thunder rush fist that left the spectators stunned. Rather than dodge, I chose to stand my ground and test my own physical resilience against it. Students screamed at the referee to stop the match before I got obliterated. I jumped in and met him head on, and we started trading punches. He was visibly shocked to find I could stand against him using a skill of my own. I kept the pressure steady, and he quickly realized I wasn't to be taken lightly, since every punch I threw landed with real weight behind it. The crowd watched in awe, since I wasn't even using a martial technique and was still matching him blow for blow, proof enough that my strength wasn't ordinary. The instructor speculated that I might have some kind of unique physique, since there was no other way to explain power that exaggerated. The principal, meanwhile, was thrilled that his supposedly mediocre school had finally produced a genuine genius. As the fight dragged on, Li Tu warned me not to get ahead of myself, insisting he would still come out on top. Seeing how desperate he was to win, I realized my raw physical strength alone wouldn't be enough to take him down, so I decided to match his earlier move and go all out myself. I told him I was getting serious now, since he'd already shown me everything he had. Fear flashed across his face the moment he saw it, clearly not expecting me to have a trump card of my own. Even the spectators were left wondering what they were watching. The instructor practically yelped at the sight of how effortlessly I handled the thunder technique. Moments later, Li Tu realized he was being overwhelmed, since my thunder attribute simply outclassed his metal one. I told him I was about to show him my real trump card, then unleashed 9 resonances on him, crushing him completely. The crowd was stunned into silence at first, but once they processed what had actually happened, the place erupted, having just witnessed someone unleash 9 full resonances. Li and Chen Tian finally realized I was the same student who had vanished from their sight that day. The principal told Chen Tian they weren't just looking at a genius anymore, but the school's dragon star. Chen Tian let out a nervous laugh, remarking that the privileged geniuses at the training camp were in for a brutal shock, comparing me to a dragon meant to soar, not sink in some pond. The principal agreed, adding that I was meant to shine on the international stage, not stay buried in a place as rural as Star City. Later that day, I went home, where my aunt had already prepared dinner and asked how the exam had gone. When I told them I'd taken first place, my uncle was overjoyed, knowing it meant I would be heading to the training camp. Just then, someone started banging loudly on the door, a woman shouting to ask if I was home. When I opened it, I almost couldn't believe what I was looking at. She introduced herself as Lin Yan's mother, explaining that her son had placed 4th and offered me 30,000 yuan to give up my slot for him. Her audacity left both me and my aunt stunned. She kept going, raising her voice and claiming the camp existed for geniuses who would one day fight on the myriad heavens battlefield, warning that people could die there, on and on with that nonsense pouring out of her. My aunt grew visibly worried, but my uncle told her to stay calm and turned to ask if I could guarantee my own safety. With whatever composure I had left, I told him yes. He then turned to face the woman, matching her tirade word for word, before finally shutting the door in her face and telling her to leave. She huffed on her way out, muttering that I'd probably get eliminated soon enough anyway. Once things settled, I told my uncle I hadn't meant to hide the danger from him. He brushed it off, saying he understood, and that since I had the resolve to face it, he trusted I could handle whatever hardship came my way. My aunt swatted him lightly on the arm and told me they weren't asking me to take first place, just to come back in one piece. Later that night, I went up to the roof to think about the journey ahead. I knew my guardians were only worried for my sake, and that alone meant I couldn't afford to let them down. I told myself I needed to grow stronger to protect the peaceful life we'd all worked so hard to build. I checked my status window and found I had 285 Dow points, which wasn't nearly enough for what I had in mind. Since I had no idea what kind of monsters awaited me at the training camp, I decided to prioritize my physical combat power above everything else. I poured points into my mortal body, and after enduring the pain, found I was still 35% short of full completion. I noticed, though, that both my Thunder and Heavenly Flame techniques had already climbed to level 2 despite only having practiced them for a few days. It made me wonder whether there were hidden conditions involved, or whether normal cultivation alone was enough to push the attributes upward. Either way, I decided to raise my efforts even further. By dawn the next day, I had pushed both attributes to level 3, and my Vital Blood technique had risen by 3 points as well. When it was finally time to leave, my aunt urged me to stay safe and to come home immediately if things became too dangerous. My uncle, on the other hand, insisted I had what it took to succeed and told me to head to the camp determined to be the very best. Once I was gone, he finally let his guard down, having spent the whole morning trying to act unbothered. Moments later, Wool pulled up beside me and told me to get in the car, and she tore down the highway at a speed that left little room for conversation until I asked why she'd wanted to see me. She explained there were a few things she needed to warn me about regarding the training camp. As president of the association, she had access to certain information on the other participants, and revealed that some of them were already on the verge of reaching Tier 2. She added that the camp was full of formidable opponents, the weakest among them already wielding B-rank techniques. Hearing this only excited me further rather than worrying me, since it meant I'd have the chance to pick up B-rank techniques quickly myself. Wu admitted I was the most talented person she'd ever encountered, but warned that I wouldn't have access to the same resources as the people I'd be facing there. She urged me to push through whatever setbacks I ran into, confident that my talent was more than enough to carry me. I thanked her for the advice, and she seemed genuinely impressed at how calm I remained, even knowing exactly how dangerous a place I was walking into. After a while, we made our way through the Tianling mountain range. Chen Tian voiced his concern about the camp being located there, but the principal told him not to worry, since a grandmaster was overseeing the entire operation, meaning no beast would dare lay a hand on the students. Apparently, the range connected to several other cities, and the monsters living within it were strong enough to rival rank 7 grandmasters. The beasts there constantly clashed with each other, far more ferocious than anything found elsewhere, to the point that even a rank 2 martial artist wouldn't carelessly wander in. As we drove the road leading into the camp, I could feel strange presences watching us, and it wasn't paranoia. The mountains genuinely were crawling with monsters. As tough as the competition promised to be, I found myself enjoying the idea of it. When we arrived at the meeting point, several other students were already gathered, staring at our group like they were sizing us up for a meal. Sensing my classmates were about to get rattled, I stepped forward and told them to follow my lead. We walked into the temporary camp with confidence, and the official informed us we'd have to wait there until everyone arrived. Even once the full group assembled, there would still be an entrance examination to get through. That came as a surprise, but before I could ask anything further, the real heavy hitters showed up. They arrived in luxury vehicles surrounded by a full convoy. The redhead was Yao Yan, a spirit reader. The man in white was Lin Xing of the Lin family, clearly someone who enjoyed showing off. The third was Tan Wo, the city lord's son, boasting a 95% fire affinity. I realized this trio had to be the group of geniuses Wu had warned me about, and I found myself curious whether they actually lived up to the reputation. Once everyone had gathered, the official laid out the rules. The training camp itself sat 30 kilometers deep within the mountain range. An entry required holding a token, each one embedded inside a specific beast. We had 8 hours to reach the camp. On paper, 8 hours seemed plenty for the distance, but that didn't account for the dangers waiting along the way. I wasn't particularly worried, since this sounded like the perfect opportunity to hunt as many beasts as I wanted, as long as I made it to camp within the time limit. One student asked what would happen if they ran into a beast too strong to handle. The official told him to consider himself unlucky, since he'd be eliminated on the spot, though someone would eventually come to retrieve him. The students protested, pointing out that the strongest among them could end up eliminated by bad luck, while the weak slipped through by chance. The official brushed off the complaint, reminding them that life simply wasn't fair, citing the example of someone who'd trained relentlessly only to have death take him at the worst possible moment. He told them to move with caution if they didn't want to run into anything too dangerous, but added that only cowards played it that safe. One student agreed loudly, mocking his more nervous classmates for being too scared to risk it. That comment set off another student who threatened to beat him senseless on the spot. The official cut in to remind everyone that fighting wasn't permitted within the camp itself, though once they reached the mountains, they were free to do whatever they wanted, including stealing tokens or beating someone down simply because they didn't like their face. Hearing that, I understood just how brutal this camp really was, actively encouraging participants to turn on each other. It was obvious more than half the group wouldn't even make it to camp in one piece. It also occurred to me that I could rack up a serious number of points if I decided to fight some of the other participants myself. The official silenced the group and announced it was time to move, blowing his whistle as everyone scattered into the woods. The two students who'd been feuding earlier immediately took off after each other and threw themselves straight into a fight, trading blows that looked fairly even. I watched from above, unimpressed, having expected these so-called geniuses to bring a little more ferocity to the table. I was about to leave and go hunt some beasts on my own when I overheard the two of them mocking some less fortunate students. That changed my mind. I grabbed a stick and walked over, telling them to cut it out, suggesting they play with me instead. One of them responded with an insult, saying neither of them had any interest in playing with me, only in beating me down. I corrected him, explaining that I meant exactly that. I wanted them to gang up and try to beat me up. The one in the blue uniform charged at me first, furious, but I drove a punch into his stomach hard enough to send him flying into the distance. The other one froze, realizing something was deeply wrong since the guy I'd just dropped was supposed to be his equal, and I'd taken him out in a single hit. He was still processing that when I closed the distance and swung the stick straight into his head, knocking him out cold. Looking down at their bodies, I told them this was exactly what they got for looking down on ordinary cultivators. Meanwhile, the security team watched on, visibly confused about where I'd come from, and clearly annoyed that I'd interrupted whatever fight they'd been enjoying watching. One of them asked if the two defeated students counted as eliminated, but another corrected him, explaining that since they'd entered the fight voluntarily, the assessment continued as normal for them. After a while, one of the two woke up in pain, only to be startled by the sight of my stick lying nearby, a reminder of how much fun I'd apparently had at his expense. The other one admitted regret over underestimating me, swearing there was no way he'd actually lose to someone like me. Once they noticed each other, something shifted, and the shared experience of getting beaten down by me turned them into unlikely friends, both agreeing they wanted revenge together. Meanwhile, I was busy carving through the forest. I ran into a pack of wild boars moving aggressively as a group, and the moment they spotted me, they charged. I cut them down in a single strike each. After clearing them out, I noticed something odd. I used to earn dozens of martial Dao points just from defeating one martial practitioner, but now that I'd grown stronger and leveled up, the rewards from weaker kills had shrunk considerably. That reminded me I still needed to find tokens. I checked inside the boars I'd just killed and found nothing, which told me the tokens had to be hidden specifically inside higher-level beasts. 30 minutes later, I noticed I could no longer find any low-level beasts the way I had when I first entered the forest. Then I ran into a rank 1 phantom night tiger. Without hesitation, I slammed my spear into it, knocking it flat before finishing it with a piercing strike to the head. The kill earned me 35 points, confirming that a rank 1 beast was basically trivial for me at this point. I dug through its body hoping for a token, and finally found one, proving my theory that they were tied specifically to higher-ranked beasts. Since it had taken 3 full hours to encounter one, I concluded that the deeper I pushed into the mountains, the higher the beast ranks climbed, though the numbers thinned out the further in I went. That meant hunting lower-ranked beasts would actually net me more total points given how plentiful they were. I shifted my approach entirely, prioritizing quantity over quality, and with 5 hours left in the assessment, I decided to push my mortal body progress as far as it could go. I hunted relentlessly, tearing through the forest and clearing out monsters like weeds. Eventually, I crossed paths with a bear, a higher-ranked beast, but even that fell with relative ease. I drove it into a tree with one punch before going after it without mercy. All it saw was a man charging at it with a punch, one powerful enough to kill it outright and shatter the tree behind it in the process. I was satisfied with my progress, since pushing my mortal body to 60% now let me kill a rank 1 mid-stage beast on raw physical strength alone. I checked my totals and found I'd already earned 254 martial Dao points, meaning just 100 more would max out my mortal body completely. With 3 hours still on the clock, I decided to keep gathering points as aggressively as I could. Then I heard a strange noise in the distance and it immediately pulled my focus. A massive golden beast appeared directly above me. This had to be the legendary Golden Rock Beast King. I stared it down as it unleashed its aura, and the shockwave alone was enough to make my legs tremble, forcing me to grip my spear tightly just to keep from being thrown clear off my feet. The force was too much. I had to retreat into the cover of a nearby tree line, wondering exactly what kind of beast I'd just encountered. I've been feeling untouchable lately, but standing anywhere near something like this made me feel like an ant. Then I noticed something, or rather, someone, confronting the massive creature head-on. Tier 7 Grandmaster Qin Tianli. I remembered him mentioning earlier that he'd be borrowing this section of the forest, though the beast clearly hadn't agreed to that arrangement. The Grandmaster decided the matter would be settled with violence, and as the two clashed, the beast was forced back. He laughed, sending a series of strikes into its body, followed by a hard blow straight to its face, then warned it, calling it a golden-winged rock and telling it to reflect on its behavior. The beast fled, and the Grandmaster shouted after it to watch its back. Once it was gone, he turned to the gathered applicants and told everyone there was no need to panic. The assessment would continue as planned. I was sweating just from watching someone that powerful in action, and right there, I made up my mind that I would one day surpass that level of strength myself. Moments later, Qin returned to camp, where the rest of the instructors waited to greet him, praising him for subduing the Golden Rock Beast King, a creature renowned for its sheer physical might. He brushed off the flattery and told them to follow him to the control room so they could review who had managed to withstand the beast's aura. Once inside, they replayed the footage from the moment the aura had been unleashed. Shin noted that Tanwo had held his ground without flinching. When he asked for details, an instructor read out his file, and Qin was surprised to learn Tanwo was the city lord's son, a man known for repeatedly producing underwhelming children. He found it almost hard to believe the man had finally produced someone talented. Lin Sheng, meanwhile, had escaped the aura entirely through his footwork, and his file showed a 96% affinity for wind. Yao Yan, a telekinetic, had withstood the pressure using her mental abilities alone. After reviewing the trio, Qin acknowledged their talent but wanted to know if anyone else had managed to endure the aura. His assistant began reading off names of others who had survived it, and after a long, unremarkable list, she explained that all of them were already tier 1 in strength, which was the only reason they hadn't blacked out. Shin wasn't particularly impressed, since they all came from major families. He asked if anyone from an ordinary background had withstood it, and she told him the students from the regular schools were all stuck at early stage tier 1. She started to bring up Star City High specifically, but King cut her off, saying he'd heard enough, since the school had never lived up to its name anyway. Just then, another instructor spotted me on screen, still hunting beasts despite having just endured the Beast King's aura. The lady instructor pulled up my file to check, then froze in visible alarm, declaring that I was some kind of monster out of Star City High. Her colleague assumed she was overreacting and grabbed the report from her to see for himself, only to freeze just as badly the moment he read it. Qin, confused why two tier 5 martial artists were shaking over a piece of paper, decided to look for himself. He genuinely struggled to accept that I was human at all. The recommendation report detailed everything I was capable of, including the fact that I was currently cultivating all 7 attributes at once. Excitement overtook him, certain he'd stumbled onto the discovery of the Millennium from a place as obscure as Star City. Then he noticed something strange. My vitality sat at only 120 points, oddly low given my apparent talent. The lady instructor reminded him that I was cultivating all 7 attributes simultaneously, and he immediately understood why I was stuck, explaining that even a god would be crippled trying to balance that many at once. He wondered aloud whether Wu had even bothered to explain how the system worked to me. Just then, an assistant arrived to announce that students had begun arriving at camp. Shin rushed outside to inspect them, and as expected, the 3 top geniuses were the first to arrive, reaching camp just 6 hours after the exam began. More applicants trickled in steadily afterward, and with only 30 minutes left, everyone had supposedly arrived except me. The other applicants assumed that whoever hadn't shown up with the clock running out simply didn't deserve a spot in the camp. Privately, King grew anxious, worried the rare talent he'd just discovered might slip away before he ever got the chance to meet him. Right as the clock was about to run out, I finally appeared in the distance. I'd been so locked into farming points that I'd completely lost track of time. The other applicants mocked me on sight, assuming I must have had a brutal time out there given how filthy I looked. The 2 students who'd wanted revenge on me earlier had also made it to camp, though they decided to hold off and settle things with me once training officially began. As the clock hit the 8-hour mark, the official gathered everyone and announced that anyone who hadn't shown up by then had failed the exam. With everyone present, he moved on to explaining the camp's structure. He described the major facilities available, a gravity training room, a footwork training room, a beast combat arena, and a martial arts pavilion where students could exchange resources for martial techniques, footwork methods, pills, and weapons up to a certain rank. Hearing this, I felt confident I'd made the right call coming here. Using any of these services, though, required spending contribution points, which could only be earned by completing the camp's various training courses, with exceptional performance earning extra rewards. Since it was getting late, the official told us we were free to rest for the night, though training was also an option for anyone who wanted it. He directed the injured students toward the dormitories, and I made my way there as well. Stepping into my assigned room, I was relieved to find it was a single, meaning I'd have full privacy while cultivating, with no one watching over my shoulder. I climbed onto the bed and prepared to max out my mortal body, having finally accumulated enough martial Dao points to finish the job. I funneled every point into the slot, and the process generated enough heat to nearly turn me into lava from the inside. But in the end, the evolution completed successfully. I could feel my body breaking apart as a flaming aura swirled around me. After a while, it settled, and I was genuinely surprised at how much raw power had come from a single physical burst. The status panel popped up, showing I'd been granted a unique Overlord body physique. I decided to test it out immediately, but the moment I gripped my spear, it cracked under the pressure of my grip. It was only C-crank alloy, and those weren't cheap, though I remembered I technically just looted it off a corpse anyway. I realized I needed to gather contribution points as quickly as possible to exchange for an A-rank alloy spear instead. That got me wondering just how much weight I could actually handle if I strapped on one of the weighted vests to start earning points. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, Tanwo was walking around in a 3-ton weighted vest, casually claiming it felt light. The other applicants stared in awe at the display, and they had every right to, since a normal Tier 1 martial artist could barely manage a few hundred kilograms. Even Yao Yan and Lin Xing admitted his strength was on another level entirely. Even Qin and the other instructors watching from the control room were impressed by his raw power. The lady assistant asked Qin when they planned to approach me about the dangers of cultivating all 7 attributes at once. He explained that they couldn't be direct about it, since geniuses tended to be proud, and a blunt warning would only backfire. He believed the better approach was to engineer a situation that would make me realize my path was flawed on my own, so I'd abandon it willingly. He then turned to ask whether the martial artists assigned to carry out the night raid had been assembled yet. The man replied it would take a little longer, since matching personnel to the varying combat strengths of the students wasn't simple, and reminded Qin that the students had just finished a brutal assessment, meaning an immediate night raid risked rattling them badly. Chen brushed this off and instructed him to assign a late-stage Tier 1 martial artist specifically to me, wanting me thoroughly crushed and humiliated. Once I'd been beaten down, he planned to explain the dangers of cultivating 7 techniques at once, expecting me to listen obediently after that. The assistants worried this might shatter my Dao heart, given how fragile a person's spirit could be in that state. But Qin dismissed the concern, insisting he was only trying to help, and that if my Dao heart shattered from something like this, it would just prove I wasn't cut out for it anyway. Later that night, I stepped out of my room and found a crowd of applicants trailing after Tanwo as he headed into the gravity room to train. With everyone's attention on him, the warehouse was left empty for me. Inside a carton, I found a scoring bracelet that every applicant was required to wear, so I grabbed one and put it on before heading over to where the weighted vests were stored. The heaviest one in the room was rated at 10 tons. Which left me genuinely stunned, wondering what it was even made of, and who in their right mind would willingly wear something like that. I tried it on and immediately realized it was far too heavy for me to manage safely. I settled instead on a 5-ton vest, which felt surprisingly light once I had it on. I ran a few laps to test it, and confirmed it was the right fit for me. Curious what Tanwo and the others had chosen, I didn't yet realize I was already stronger than I assumed compared to them. Convinced they were still ahead of me, I decided to go watch their training session, in hopes of picking up something useful. Meanwhile, the others were fawning over Tanwo, who had entered the gravity room wearing his 3-ton vest, and had also set the gravity multiplier to 2. Meaning he was effectively handling 6 tons. He was clearly struggling, but the applicants found it impressive regardless. When I learned the actual weight he was carrying, I realized I'd seriously misjudged how tough this so-called overlord body of mine actually was. Just then, Chen Shan and Li Tu approached and asked why I wasn't entering the gravity room myself. Both admitted they were nervous about embarrassing themselves given how strong their competitors clearly were. Seeing them hesitate, I decided to step into the room myself. The other applicants were visibly stunned, assuming I must have a screw loose. Some figured I wasn't even wearing a weighted vest at all, since my jacket hid it completely. People kept talking trash as I walked in, but I stayed silent and let it go. Gravity rooms were notoriously expensive to build, which was why only noble families typically had access to them. Getting to use one for free wasn't an opportunity I was going to pass up. Since I already had a 5-ton vest on, setting the gravity multiplier to 2 would have effectively doubled it to 10 tons, which felt risky. So I settled on 1.5 instead to last longer. Even at that setting, the weight was crushing enough that I nearly lost my footing entirely. I strained through the pain while the other applicants kept mocking me, insisting I wasn't even wearing a vest despite the gravity being set to 1.5 times. They assumed, since I'd arrived last that day, that I had to be one of the weaker participants. Instead of running around trying to prove anything, I simply sat down and focused on cultivating under the crushing weight. 2 hours later, I'd managed to level up several of my other attributes, all except thunder and fire, and my vitality had climbed from 126 to 130. I was impressed by the results and figured the other training rooms probably offered similar benefits, since the gravity room alone had already paid off in points. I struggled to my feet afterward, and the applicants still watching mocked me again for looking so wrecked. Just then, dying of heat, I pulled off my jacket. And that was the moment the two mocking me realized I'd been wearing a weighted vest the entire time. Still, the watching applicants reasoned that since the last person to enter had only managed 500 kilograms and was already trembling under it, I clearly wasn't weak. Even so, they figured I couldn't possibly compare to Tanwo. That was when they noticed Tanwo stepping out, visibly shocked that he'd carried over 6 tons and lasted a full 2 hours under it. They immediately crowned him the strongest among them in pure physical toughness. Exhausted, he dropped the weighted vest and flexed in front of the crowd, still watching him. Lin Sheng walked over and admitted that Tanwo was clearly number 1 in raw strength, but challenged him to come try the agility room instead, promising to show him who the real boss was there. Tanwo conceded he had nothing to offer against him when it came to agility, crediting Lin Sheng's wind attribute for the edge. Overhearing them mention A-rank movement techniques, I decided to go watch for myself. I joined the others to see Lin Sheng demonstrate his A-rank technique, Flying Swan Cloud, and what really stunned the crowd was that he'd set the difficulty all the way to maximum. The fluidity of his movement left everyone watching in awe, petals seeming to spring out of nowhere as he moved. I registered the technique into my archive immediately, then started mimicking the movement without wasting any time. The other applicants mocked me the second they noticed, asking what exactly I thought I was doing, insisting there was no way I could learn the Flying Swan technique just by watching it once. I ignored them and kept practicing, and as I did, my mastery level steadily climbed. Before long, the system confirmed I had officially reached the beginner stage of the technique. I was relieved to finally have an A-rank technique under my belt, though I had to admit it was a bit too flashy for my taste. Almost embarrassing to actually perform. Since I'd never seen the proper, more restrained version, I had no choice but to copy exactly what Lin Sheng had shown. Once I came back to myself, I figured there was no real need to bother with the agility room anymore, since I'd already picked up the technique. I started thinking about heading to the Fierce Beast room instead, hoping to farm more points to push my vitality higher. That was when I noticed the other applicants staring at me, whispering about how absurdly flashy my movements had looked. It hit me then that I'd probably copied Lin Sheng's style a little too closely, theatrics included. Realizing he definitely wasn't the right mentor to model my movement after, I quickly slipped away from the scene. As I left, I sensed someone trailing behind me, and sure enough, it was the Vendetta twins, still determined to settle their score with me. Knowing I was headed for the Fierce Beast room, they planned to wait by the door and ambush me the moment I stepped back out. Meanwhile, Xiao and Tanwo had started up a friendly rivalry, competing over who could take down the most beasts. I arrived to find the two of them mid-argument, and since I'd never seen a telekinetic fight before, I decided to stick around and watch before heading off to hunt my own targets. Xiao stepped into the room, and to my genuine shock, she lifted off the ground entirely. Levitation? Like that was typically reserved for grandmasters, which told me just how rare her psychokinetic ability really was. As if that weren't enough, my jaw dropped further when she started taking down monsters with beams of pure light. One beast attempted to ambush her from behind, but she caught it effortlessly midair with her power alone. With the beast pinned in place, she cut it down without mercy, using her light beams, and that was when I finally understood those beams weren't just light, they were essentially blades. Watching everything she'd done so far, I started to understand exactly why psychokinetic users had such a fearsome reputation. She then ran into a giant python, conjured a massive light sword, and hurled it forward, splitting the snake clean in half. That left me even more shaken, since I hadn't even noticed her holding a weapon beforehand. I also knew a blade that size would carry serious weight. Lin Sheng explained to the other applicants that what they were watching was a martial art exclusive to psychokinetics, one ranked impressively high. The applicants were stunned, having never heard of anything like it before, and asked how he knew so much, also wanting to know if Tanwo had an A-rank skill of his own. He confirmed it did, and the others practically lost it, already half convinced he was some kind of obsessive walking encyclopedia. With every genius around me clearly sitting on high-tier techniques, I realized just how stacked this training camp really was, and I felt genuinely glad I'd ended up here. Out of curiosity, I checked on Tanwo and was surprised to find he wasn't using any martial art at all while taking down beasts. It was clear he wasn't ready to show his real trump card yet, but I was confident I'd find a way to learn from him eventually. I was eager to pursue the psychokinetic path myself, but my spiritual power was too low. It required at least 100 points, and I was still 73 short. Given how much I needed, I made up my mind to challenge the entire beast room at once, even if it meant going on a full killing spree to close the gap. I stepped into the room while the two Vendetta twins waited outside, still planning to teach me a lesson the moment I came out. Their plans fell apart the instant they saw the sheer number of monsters I was preparing to take on. They were convinced I'd completely lost my mind, certain that challenging a dozen fierce beasts at once was practically suicide. Panicking, they even considered fetching an instructor to save me, fully expecting me to be torn apart. Inside, I provoked the monsters into rushing me all at once. I leapt back to dodge the first wave before lunging straight into them, punching hard enough to rupture their insides on impact. The twins watched in stunned silence, since what I was doing would have given even mid-grade martial artists serious trouble. One of them noticed the footwork I was using and realized with a jolt that I'd already mastered Lin Xing's technique and was actively using it. They argued briefly over how that was even possible, but eventually accepted that I was simply an absurd level of talented, having copied the technique after seeing it only once. One of them suggested they drop the whole vendetta entirely, and the other didn't object. For a moment, he reconsidered, but his friend pointed out exactly what I'd just done in the training room, and watching me clear every beast in the room within minutes settled the matter for good. Meanwhile, I checked the points awarded for taking down such high-level beasts and found the total disappointingly small, confirming my suspicion that the stronger I became, the harder it got to keep accumulating points efficiently. I barely had a moment to catch my breath before more monsters emerged from hiding, and I forced myself back onto my feet, knowing rest wasn't an option yet. One tried to ambush me from behind, but I reacted instantly and punched it straight into the afterlife. I let a terrifying aura roll off me, enough to make the remaining beasts hesitate, though I wasn't in the mood to grant them any mercy, since I still needed their Tao values. I went after them without restraint, clearing them out completely. Outside, the twins finally decided it was in their best interest to become the forgiving twins instead. They figured running into me after everything they just witnessed wouldn't end well for them, so they quietly slipped away, passing the battle room where the other geniuses were training. One of their colleagues, surprised to see them back so soon, asked how the revenge mission had gone, and the two could only answer nervously, privately, just relieved to still have their heads attached to their necks. Just then, Xia and Tanwo emerged from the beast room as well, with Tanwo finishing at 280 points total, and Xiaoho close behind at 270. Their usual circle of followers praised them, tallying up the number of beasts each had defeated. As for their weighted vest contributions, Tanwo had logged 100 points, while Xiao sat at 50. Numbers that left their followers in awe, since the best any of them had managed was 30. The conversation quickly turned to how powerful these three geniuses truly were, judging by the sheer number of beasts they'd cleared. The forgiving twins, though, were the only ones who knew there was an even more dangerous presence in the camp. An hour later, I'd left behind a literal mountain of corpses in the beast room and was running on fumes, though I still hadn't hit my target point total. Checking my training wristwatch, I found I'd earned 700 points overall. Without wasting any time, I headed straight for the martial arts pavilion. At the pavilion, I approached the receptionist and picked up a journal listing everything available for exchange. The prices on the A-rank skills were staggering. The attendant asked if I was ready to place an order, clearly assuming under her breath that I wasn't going to be able to afford much of anything. When I finally decided, I told her I wanted spirit gathering pills, asking if it was true they help boost spiritual power. She confirmed it, though she warned the effect only worked once. I went straight for the tier 4 spirit gathering pill, and her expression shifted the moment she saw my actual point total, clearly struggling to believe what she was looking at. Composing herself, she handed over the pill as promised. I thanked her and asked if she had any alloy spears available. By the time I finished purchasing one, I'd completely drained my remaining points. The spear I walked away with turned out to be a C-Crank Fire Dual attribute weapon. My stats had improved slightly from the whole exchange, though I knew I still needed far more Dao points to pursue what I actually had in mind. Back in my room, I opened the box the attendant had given me and pulled out the pill inside. I swallowed it and almost immediately felt the changes taking hold in my body. With my resolve set, I told myself I was going to become a spirit master, no matter what it took. The exhaustion built up in my nerves drained away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of comfort. My mind felt unusually sharp, sensitive enough to register everything happening around me. Once the process finished, I checked the results and found my spiritual power had risen by exactly 24 points. Pulling up my status window, I saw my spirit stat now sitting at 50.5 and quickly calculated that even pouring in all 490 of my remaining martial Dao points would still leave me 0.5% short of the threshold I needed. The remaining gap came down to just 5 points, the equivalent of a single beast kill. I genuinely regretted not pushing through one more fight before leaving the beast room, but there was no point dwelling on it. Meanwhile, over at the camp warehouse, the instructors assigned to the night raid had gathered, reviewing leaflets detailing the students assigned to them. Several were paired with the camp's geniuses. One man, Bu Jingfang, remarked that if he'd still been in high school himself, these so-called geniuses wouldn't even have qualified as his sparring partners. A much larger man revealed his target was Wang Tanwo, whose vitality sat at 340 points, noting that even Jingfang hadn't reached that level back in his own school day. The other two instructors discussed their own assignments, one paired with a student boasting over 300 vitality, the other handling an aspiring spirit master. Jingfang checked his own assignment and found he'd been paired with me, listed at a mere 123 vitality points. His colleagues immediately questioned why he'd been handed someone who looked so unimpressive on paper, and one instructor assumed it had to be a mistake on Grandmaster Qin's part. Qin walked in just then and clarified the pairing was deliberate. Jingfang pushed back, openly calling me trash, but Qin told him not to be fooled, since my combat power already rivaled that of a Tier 1 high-stage martial artist. The room fell silent in disbelief, since no one expected someone with barely over 100 vitality to be able to challenge a real martial artist. Qin told Jingfang he'd understand once their weapons actually crossed. Jingfang kept complaining about being assigned to bully a junior, pointing out he himself carried nearly 500 vitality and was on the verge of reaching Tier 2. Qin responded by smacking him on the head, telling him to follow orders and go all out from the very first exchange, adding that it would be best if he beat me badly enough that I started questioning whether I even wanted to continue this path. Still skeptical about fighting someone he saw as a weak child, Jingfang asked if Qin held some kind of personal grudge against me, warning that he wouldn't take responsibility if he ended up crippling me. Qin only smiled and told him to beat me senseless without holding back, promising there would be no blame, only a reward waiting for him afterward. Shortly after, Qin gave the order to begin, and the raiders moved out toward the dormitories to carry out the drill. They split up to track down their assigned targets, and fighting broke out almost immediately. I heard the commotion and wondered if it might be a sneak attack of some kind. Before I could think much further, my door was sliced open. Jingfang rushed in and struck without warning, but I managed to dodge it. My first thought was that this might be the All Heaven's 10,000 races, since I'd heard they regularly hunted down human geniuses to weaken humanity's overall strength. I grabbed my Thunderfire spear, still trying to gauge how strong this attacker actually was, while Jingfang pressed forward, boasting about his own strength and telling me I should consider myself unlucky to have crossed paths with him. It quickly became clear he was a human Tier 1 high-stage martial artist rather than anything from the myriad races, and that realization made me smile. This was exactly what I needed. Beating him would hand me the last 5 points required to finally become a spirit master. Jingfang looked genuinely thrown when he saw me settle into a proper fighting stance, clearly wondering if I'd lost my mind. Our weapons collided, and that was when he registered just how absurd my physical strength actually was. Something else struck him too. A Tier 1 early-stage martial artist had no business wielding power like this. For my part, I was giving everything I had, since this was my first real fight against a high-stage opponent. I swung my spear with as much force as I could muster, and the pressure behind it was enough to make him leap back. Jingfang started reconsidering his earlier dismissal, realizing this kid in front of him was genuinely monstrous, though as an experienced fighter, he knew a real battle was never decided by physical strength alone. It was the first time I'd ever seen a fire attribute martial artist up close, and I was honestly impressed by the display. He lunged at me, taunting and asking how exactly I planned to handle a B-ranks martial art, then unleashed a flame slash. I figured this attack had to be at least as strong as the void-breaking finger, so I wrapped my spear in lightning and blocked it head-on, the impact sending him stumbling backward and shattering the wall behind him. Sweat broke out across his face as he struggled to process that I'd blocked his fire technique simply by externalizing lightning, privately admitting that my talent was terrifying and finally understanding why Qin had told him to go all out from the start. Still, he kept taunting, suggesting that I clearly didn't know any thunder attribute spear techniques, otherwise I wouldn't have needed to defend so plainly. I admitted he was right. I didn't know any dedicated thunder spear techniques, but asked what might happen if I layered something else on top of what I already had. I fused 2 attributes together, lightning and fire, and the moment he saw it, Jingfang was left utterly stunned by the attribute fusion in front of him. I pulled off the fusion with relative ease right in front of him. Jingfang was left utterly stunned. having always believed attribute fusion was nothing more than a myth. He was still reeling from the shock when I closed the distance and unleashed a powerful strike. He tried to salvage his pride with a counterattack, but my strength simply overwhelmed him, sending him crashing straight through the wall behind him. The kill earned me 7 points, and I smiled, since that was exactly the amount I needed to advance into becoming a telekinetic. A few seconds earlier, Kin and his assistant had been standing outside the dorm, waiting for an update, fully expecting that I'd already be taking the beating of my life, after which Kin planned to use the experience to convince me to abandon multiple guiding techniques and commit to just one. That was the moment Jing Fang came flying through the wall and landed unconscious right at the Grandmaster's feet, his face battered beyond recognition. Both Kin and the assistant stood frozen, stunned that I'd defeated him so cleanly. At the same time, the three geniuses had each finished off their own opponents, sending them crashing through walls in much the same fashion. They stepped through the wreckage, complaining to the Grandmaster that he should have sent stronger opponents, since the ones he'd picked were embarrassingly weak. Tanwo noticed there were actually 4 down instructors on the ground, and that whoever had taken down the 4th had somehow finished even faster than the 3 of them combined. Lin Xing assumed Jing Fang must simply have been the weakest of the group. The assistant, however, knew better, aware that Jing Fang was actually the strongest fighter among the 4 instructors involved. Qin wasn't particularly surprised that the 3 geniuses had won their fights. What puzzled him was that I, still an early-stage Tier 1 martial artist by rank, had somehow taken down a Tier 2 opponent faster than any of them. He couldn't quite work out how I'd managed it. Just then, an official came rushing over with urgent news. Qin assumed it was simply another student casualty and brushed it off as routine, but the official clarified it wasn't that at all. It was about me using attribute fusion against Jing Fang. Qin initially dismissed it as nothing serious, until the words actually registered and he grabbed the man by the collar, demanding to know if he was certain. The official confirmed he combined thunder and fire to defeat Jing Fang, adding that it was all there on the recording if Qin doubted it, and that Jing Fang himself could confirm it. Sure enough, Jing Fang regained consciousness just long enough to verify it himself. Qin's reaction bordered on panic. He explained that the only known genius in history to ever achieve attribute fusion had spent 12 full years mastering it, and yet I'd apparently pulled it off in a single month. Practically buzzing with excitement, he started declaring me some kind of celestial prodigy who descended to Earth in human form. His assistant asked whether fusion was really as powerful as he was making it sound, and he explained that the very first person to achieve it had been able to suppress 2 Tier 2 fighters while still stuck at Tier 1 himself. When she asked why something this significant wasn't more widely known, he explained that research showed the technique was brutally difficult to pull off and carried a real risk of permanently crippling one's cultivation, often trapping the user at Tier 1 for life. Still, he couldn't get over the fact that I'd succeeded in a single month, a clear sign of just how extraordinary my comprehension was. Given that I held affinity for every attribute, he reasoned that combining all 7 would be utterly overwhelming. Enough, he speculated, to let me suppress even the emperors of the myriad races with a single strike. His assistants told him to rein it in, pointing out he was getting carried away, since fusing even 2 attributes was already considered nearly impossible. Qian acknowledged he'd gotten ahead of himself, but insisted he couldn't allow me to keep cultivating all 7 attributes regardless, warning that doing so would likely cap me at a 3-attribute fusion at most, which he considered a serious problem. Just then, the official added one more detail, that I'd overwhelmed Jing Fang purely through raw strength. Qin scolded him for leaving out something that important until now. The trio of geniuses stood in disbelief, since I had barely over 100 vital blood points compared to Jing Fang's 500, and yet I'd still overpowered him outright. Qin concluded that my physique itself might be something legendary, and decided on the spot that a sparring match would be held the following day to properly assess both my combat strength and vital blood. He instructed the others to bring Tanwo and the rest of the top geniuses to face me directly, wanting to see firsthand what would happen when someone as anomalous as me collided with the camp's strongest talents. Back in my wrecked dorm room, I ignored the noise still echoing outside and focused on raising my stats. I poured every remaining Dao point I had into my spirit stat in one shot. Once it climbed high enough, I concentrated my mental energy toward becoming a telekinetic. As my mind expanded, a strange sensation washed over me, almost like a third arm had sprouted out of nowhere. The moment my spirit value crossed 100, the unfamiliar feeling settled in fully. I decided to test the new ability right away, lifting my already ruined bed slightly off the ground using nothing but telekinesis. It worked on the first try, and the excitement got the better of me, so I started lifting several other objects in the room, with a simple wave of my hand. I also made a mental note to find an opportunity to study Xiao's A-rank telekinetic martial art, along with Tanwo's offensive A-rank technique. The next day, one of the camp instructors, Lind, ordered everyone to assemble within a minute or lose contribution points for every second they were late. Terrified of losing points they'd worked hard for, the students scrambled outside despite still being covered in bruises from the previous night's raid. Even though it was only day one, most of them already looked thoroughly worn down by the brutal pace. I, on the other hand, strolled out in perfect shape, seemingly the only one unaffected. Once everyone gathered, Lind complimented them on showing up on time, admitting he hadn't expected most of them to even be able to walk after the beating they'd taken. One student tried to claim he could have beaten his assigned martial artist if he hadn't been ambushed, going on about how the instructor had specifically targeted a sensitive area. Lind wasn't impressed, reminding him bluntly that he'd have been dead already if it had been an actual assassin from the myriad races instead of a friendly drill. The student grudgingly admitted the instructor had a point, and his friends immediately started teasing him with a new nickname over the whole ordeal. I listened quietly, agreeing with Lin's logic, though I also understood why everyone felt a little raw after the day they'd just had. Lin then announced he was giving them an outlet to vent and a chance to show off, explaining that a comprehensive test was coming up to measure vital blood, combat power, spirit, strength, speed, and overall martial mastery. Afterward, students would duel each other to settle their combat rankings, with the top 10 earning daily contribution points based on placement. The moment this was announced, everyone's attention shifted toward Tanwo, Lin Xing, and Xia, the assumption being that the top 3 spots were already locked in, leaving everyone else to scramble for the remaining slots from 4th to 10th. I personally only cared about claiming first place, already curious what kind of reward came with it. As the students kept buzzing about the upcoming test, Lin told them to quiet down and follow him to the testing site. We arrived shortly after at a warehouse converted into a temporary testing ground, complete with a Tier 2 combat power detector. While everyone chattered, Kin quietly observed me from a distance, noting how effortlessly I'd blended into the crowd without drawing attention. A student standing near me noticed Kin's gaze and assumed it had to be directed at himself, given his lack of any real talent. I just stared at him, privately amused, knowing full well Kin's attention was actually on me. A few minutes later, Kin addressed the group, expressing high hopes for everyone and raising the stakes even further by announcing an additional reward beyond what had already been promised. Whoever scored highest overall in the comprehensive test would receive their choice of an A-rank martial art or movement technique. That announcement electrified the crowd and immediately raised the intensity of the competition, since it meant Tanwo and the other geniuses would now be going all out. Just as expected, the news caught Tanwo's attention immediately, given how rare and expensive A-rank techniques were, even among powerful noble families. Xiao seemed equally drawn in, eager for the chance to choose her own. Lin Xing, meanwhile, mainly wanted something that could complement his flying swan cloud movement technique, hoping to prove that speed alone could rival any other combat style. As for me, I was thrilled at the idea of adding yet another A-rank technique to my growing collection. Qin kept his focus locked on me, clearly curious to see what I was capable of. He called Lin Xing up first to begin testing, followed by Xiao, then Tanwo third. Chatter spread through the hall over the sheer firepower of this lineup, with no one eager to take the unlucky 4th slot. Certain whoever followed that trio would look embarrassingly weak by comparison after witnessing their monstrous scores. Then Qin announced that I would be taking the 4th spot, and the entire hall fell silent, every eye turning toward me. That Qin really did have his attention fixed on me specifically. The crowd immediately started mocking me, recalling that I'd been the very last student to arrive during the entrance assessment, wondering aloud if I'd somehow offended Qin to end up in such an unfortunate spot. Meanwhile, the two who already knew exactly what I was capable of stayed silent, quietly waiting for the moment the crowd would be left speechless, forced to eat every word. Lin Xing stepped up first, and the instructor reminded him to test his raw physical combat power before moving on to his martial arts score. He clearly wasn't thrilled about the first part, since physical strength had never been his strongest area. Still, he gave it everything he had, and the detector registered just over 4,000. An absurdly high number for someone who just claimed it was his weakest category. The crowd was stunned that he'd scored that high without even using a martial art. Though while everyone buzzed over his raw score, I found myself far more interested in what he'd do with an actual technique. I reasoned that Lin Xing had to have at least a B-rank martial art to go along with his A-rank movement technique, and the idea of copying it had me genuinely excited. He unleashed his skill, the cloud-hidden Gale Fist, driving a powerful punch into the combat power detector. The reading came back above 5,600, leaving the crowd completely stunned, since that number was considered standard for a Tier 2 martial artist. an absurd result for someone still classified as high stage tier 1. While everyone marveled over his performance, I quietly copied his B-rank wind attribute technique for myself. Xiao told him to wipe the smug look off his face, brushing the result off as nothing special, then stepped up and scored a little over 3,000 on her own physical test. No one was surprised by that, since telekinetics were generally known for weaker physical bodies, their real strength lying in telekinetic martial arts instead. She took a deep breath and condensed spiritual energy into the shape of a massive mallet. I was practically giddy watching it, immediately copying her spirit weapon condensation technique the moment I saw it, and I started looking forward to everything else I might be able to copy before the day was through. With her condensed weapon in hand, she struck the tester and scored nearly 6,000, nearly doubling Lin Xing's result. The crowd was floored, half joking that heaven was clearly playing favorites with her, while the others openly envied her telekinetic ability. I quietly worked on absorbing the technique myself, trying to master it on the spot. I managed to condense a small amount of spiritual energy, but it dissolved before I could shape it into anything solid, leaving me completely drained in the process. As impressive as the technique was, capable of forming anything from weapons to full beasts, it clearly demanded an enormous amount of spirit to sustain. Given where my own spirit stat currently sat, I knew matching Xiao's level wasn't happening anytime soon, so I decided to shelve it and work toward it gradually. With Manhwa next, I was eager to see his offensive style in action. Given that he carried the barbarian god physique, his raw combat power was expected to be far more terrifying than anyone else's, which left most of the students convinced he was the clear favorite for first place. I was curious myself, mostly wanting to compare his physique against my own overlord physique. He talked himself up before striking the tester, landing a score above 5,000, just 300 shy of Lin Xing's full martial arts result, using only his fists. Qin praised him, and Manhwa thanked him before announcing he'd follow up with an actual technique that got my full attention. He activated his A-rank fire attribute skill, the Bone Nether Flame Fist, and I copied it instantly, recognizing it as the same technique I'd seen listed in the martial arts pavilion for 2,800 contribution points. He unleashed the punch and scored above 7,500, stunning the crowd completely, a result on par with a tier 2 mid-stage martial artist. What made it even more impressive was that his vital blood sat at only around 350. Qin praised him further, remarking that his father would be proud, given the man had apparently fathered over a dozen children chasing the dream of producing a grandmaster. Then Qin called me up next. As I walked toward the stage, the murmuring started immediately, some commenting that I looked far too relaxed, assuming I simply didn't care since I was bound to lose anyway. Once I stepped onto the platform, Qin reminded me of the test rules, and without hesitation, I prepared to throw my first punch. I took a deep breath, and as my fist surged forward, I made myself a quiet promise to claim first place. The moment my fist connected with the tester, the sheer pressure of the impact sent a gust of wind tearing through the hall. The score that came back was an outrageous 6,500, leaving the entire crowd speechless. Even Qin looked visibly shaken, clearly realizing he had badly underestimated me. The crowd stayed completely silent, struggling to process what they'd just seen. A few started wondering if the machine itself was malfunctioning, while others pointed out that I had come in dead last during the entrance assessment, insisting it made no sense for me to suddenly perform like some kind of overpowered freak. Even the camp's 3 celebrated geniuses found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Lin Xing assumed I must have been hiding my true level all along, while Manhwa admitted almost reluctantly that he'd clearly been too arrogant earlier. I broke the silence myself, asking Qin if I should move on to the next test. He told me to go ahead, and as I prepared to throw my next punch, I started rapidly absorbing Manhwa's Bone Nether Flame Fist technique. I picked it up even faster than I had Lin Xing's movement technique, which only confirmed how well it suited my own physique. While everyone waited to see what I'd do, Lind and Qin speculated on how high my martial arts score might climb. Lind assumed I probably wouldn't perform well, reasoning that coming from a poor family meant I likely couldn't afford any decent technique. Qin, watching my current state, suspected the opposite, sensing I was about to unleash something far more advanced than anyone expected. I finished mastering the Bone Nether Flame Fist to beginner level in under a minute. The moment flames wrapped around my fist, the crowd recognized it instantly as the exact technique Manhwa had just used. I steadied myself, curious to feel what a real, high-grade offensive technique was capable of, and swung. The force of the punch nearly knocked people off their feet, kicking up a thick wave of dust across the room. Once it settled, the score came into view. A little over 9,000, a number considered standard for a Tier 2 high-stage martial artist. despite my own rank still sitting at Tier 1 early stage. Lin found the whole thing absurd, given how low my vital blood reading was. Lin Sheng refused to accept what he'd just watched, while Shato reasoned aloud that my vital blood must logically be sitting above 500, since that was the expected baseline for a Tier 2 high-stage fighter. Hearing that, Tenwo resigned himself to accepting defeat gracefully, since even his own vital blood hadn't quite reached 400. Moments later, though, the real shock hit. My vital blood was sitting at a measly 137. Nobody wanted to believe a number that low could produce results like that. Someone even joked that my score was probably missing a 0, since no one with stats that unremarkable should logically be performing on par with a Tier 2 high-stage martial artist. Kin watched me quietly as I stepped away from the vital blood detector, then announced it was time to begin the combat ranking tournament. He explained the format, a challenge-based system where any participant could freely call out an opponent, with the eventual winner being whoever no one else dared to challenge by the end. The instant he finished laying out the rules, Lin Xing immediately called me out. The man had picked me specifically because my vitality looked weak, assuming he could simply use his movement technique to wear me down. But the old man, the grandmaster overseeing things, refused the request and instead suggested all three of them take me on together. The suggestion completely shocked them, since they'd all assumed I was too weak to even justify going up against the three of them at once. He then turned to me and asked for my thoughts. I had no objections, which clearly surprised them, though the looks on their faces made it obvious they were determined to make me pay for it regardless. The Grandmaster called for the match to begin, and the three of them scattered in different directions. The white-haired one assumed he could launch a sneak attack, while the other two handled the rest, confident in his speed. But the other two warned him from a distance that something was wrong. Before he could react, I was already at his side, throwing my fist and telling him goodbye. My hands stopped short of him with sudden force, and he used the opening to retreat, thanking Xiao Yan and warning the others about my unusual speed. I honestly couldn't put into words how strange that felt, since it was my first time being restrained by telekinesis. I shifted my focus to my first real target, Xiao Yan, weaving in a zigzag pattern to dodge her powers. She immediately noticed I was using the Flying Swan's startling cloud step. The other two charged in, realizing I likely had dual attributes. The muscular one moved to pin me down so she could lock me in place, activating his bone nether flame fist, and I countered with the same technique in kind. That was the moment she locked onto me, freezing me completely in place, an absolute nuisance to deal with. The white-haired one followed up with a kick while I was stuck. The Grandmaster, watching, wondered if it was too soon for me to face three opponents at once, especially with a Spirit Master involved, since breaking free from that kind of lock usually required either brute physical force or spiritual power of one's own, and my physical strength alone wasn't supposed to be enough. Still, he noticed I was smiling. The moment all three closed in together, I released a massive shockwave and broke free outright, the force strong enough to make Xiao Yan cough up blood. Then it was my turn to have some fun. I grabbed the two of them and absorbed the full force of their attack like it was nothing. The other applicants couldn't believe what they were seeing, that I'd broken free using physical strength alone and was now overpowering both of them, looking less like a person and more like something else entirely. But I wasn't finished. I twisted them around, spinning them through the air, and once they lost their footing completely, it was time for the finale. I drove them both into the ground, and the white-haired one coughed up blood as the impact landed. Everyone watching fell completely silent. The scene in front of them, too brutal and surreal to process, like something pulled straight out of an action film. As a reward for taking my hits, the two of them got a long, well-earned nap. Then my attention landed on the last target, Xiao Yan, who threw in the towel immediately before I even got the chance to enjoy myself with her. The crowd genuinely couldn't believe I'd won, and won that decisively. The Grandmaster told everyone to quiet down and asked if anyone wanted to step up next. But after watching what had just happened, every single one of them found some excuse to avoid facing me. With no challengers left, I claimed first place, and he announced that places 2 through 10 still came with rewards, so the rest of them should keep competing for those spots. He then turned to me and said that as the winner, I'd be coming with him to claim my reward and choose an A-rank martial art. My heart raced with excitement. As we walked, the Grandmaster mentioned he'd been watching me closely since the very day I arrived at the training camp, and asked why I'd chosen to hide my strength when everyone else around me was eager to show off. I explained my reasoning, without real power or influence behind me. Drawing attention too early would only make me an easy target. He laughed, clearly appreciating my instinct for self-preservation, and admitted that the entire tournament had actually been arranged specifically with me in mind. He told me that in the current state of the world, Resources were almost entirely concentrated on genuine geniuses. He assured me I no longer needed to hide my strength and offered me his personal protection going forward. Grateful for the backing, I thanked him sincerely. We soon arrived at the martial arts pavilion, where the receptionist snapped to attention as he ordered her to bring out the full list of available techniques. He told me to look through it carefully and ask if anything wasn't clear. I asked him which martial art he thought would suit me best, but before answering, he asked which ones I already knew. I listed off the Bone Nether Fire Fist, the Flying Swan Startling Cloud Step, the Cloud-Hiding Gale Fist, and the Void-Breaking Finger. His expression tightened as he pointed out that none of those techniques were even part of the camp's inventory. He asked, almost in disbelief, if I had genuinely learned them just from watching Lin Xing use them once. When I confirmed it without much fuss, a bead of sweat rolled down his face. The pavilion administrator watched in total shock, clearly wondering who I was to have a grandmaster like Qin Tianli personally walk me through choosing a technique. As we flipped through the catalog together, he suggested that since I already had offensive and movement skills covered, a control-type martial art would help balance things out. He recommended the A-rank Flame Cage, a technique that condensed fire spiritual chi into a kind of prison capable of trapping and immobilizing enemies outright. He explained that control-type arts required spiritual chi to actually leave the body, a step most Tier 2 martial artists still struggled with. Despite the fact that I was only at Tier 1 initial stage, he believed my talent was enough to manage it anyway. He mentioned he knew the technique himself and offered to demonstrate it first so I could decide whether it suited me. I thanked him and he summoned a small flame in his palm. He noted just how immense the power behind control-type arts really was, walking me through the basic strategy. Trap the opponent inside the flame cage first and follow up with a finishing strike for a clean kill. He warned, though, that maintaining the cage while simultaneously launching an attack wasn't something I'd be capable of yet, admitting he himself had only managed that level of coordination after reaching Tier 3. Hearing how difficult it actually was, I immediately shook my head and told him I was passing on the technique in favor of something else. He looked genuinely surprised at how quickly I'd let go of the idea, privately noting that most geniuses he'd encountered were far too prideful to back down so easily. What he didn't know was the system had already notified me that I'd picked up the flame cage technique for free. He flipped through the pages again and this time recommended a defensive option, the A-rank Earth attribute skill, Thick Earth Armor, which condensed protective armor across the user's body for exceptionally high defense. I turned the idea over and realized pairing a defensive art with my unique physique could produce some genuinely powerful results, so I told him I'd take his advice. As we finalized the choice, he asked what my special physique was actually called. I told him that it was the Overlord Body, privately hoping he'd be impressed enough to hand me an entire basket of A-rank skills on the spot. Instead, he admitted he'd never heard of anything by that name before, which left me no choice but to awkwardly confess that I'd simply made the name up myself. He assumed it had to be some undocumented physique type, nodding as he commented on just how terrifying the strength amplification was, admitting he'd never seen a Tier 1 martial artist hit numbers like mine before. Just then, he received an urgent call from an administrator, reporting that the contribution records showed I'd been wearing my weighted vest through the entire tournament. He looked stunned, asking if I'd really fought Tanwo and the others while carrying that extra weight the whole time. I confirmed it casually, explaining I wouldn't have earned nearly as many points otherwise. He pressed a hand to his chest, telling himself quietly to stay calm, reminding himself that I simply wasn't someone who could be judged by ordinary standards. He told me to stop obsessing over points and take the vest off immediately, promising there would be plenty of other rewards waiting for me down the line. I agreed and handed the vest over to the pavilion administrator, warning her beforehand that it was on the heavier side. She insisted she was a dignified Tier 2 martial artist and could handle it just fine. But the moment she took it, her eyes went wide. She dropped it almost instantly, and it crashed straight through the wooden floor with a loud boom. She asked how many kilograms it actually weighed, and I told her, casually, that it was 5 tons. Kin broke into a sweat, realizing a Tier 1 trainee had somehow carried that much weight while simultaneously defeating 3 late-stage geniuses. He threw an arm around my shoulder, calling me a little monster, and told me he had another A-rank martial art in mind for me. He recalled that I used a spear and brought up Grandmaster Zhang Lin of Yang City, who possessed an extremely powerful A-rank Thunder Spear technique. His plan was to arrange a sparring match against the rival Grandmaster's student as a way to trick the technique out of him. I pointed out that this didn't sound particularly fair, but he brushed it off, complaining that Zhang Lin constantly mocked his training camp as being full of nothing but trash, and he wanted the satisfaction of mocking him right back. He told me to head back and prepare, since we'd be leaving for Yang City early the next morning. I returned to my room, pleased to find the staff had already tidied it up. Sitting down, I checked my system and noticed several new skills had registered: Flame Cage, Spirit Soul Capture Art, and Thick Earth Armor. I decided I'd cultivate all three to at least a basic level before morning. Meanwhile, Qin called his rival and told him to have the Thunder Spear art ready for a challenge. Zhang Lin brushed off the threat entirely, bragging that his own training camp in Yang City had produced a wood spirit body genius who had already broken through to Tier 2. He boasted that his student, Lin Shunfeng, had mastered the A-rank control-type technique, Wood Prison, in just 2 days. As he spoke, he watched the green-haired student attempt the technique, only for the wooden vines to stop growing partway and dissolve before they could fully trap the target. Lin Chunfeng sighed at the failure, but assured his master confidently that he'd reach basic level within a month. Still on the phone, Zhang Lin kept needling Qin, mentioning that it had taken him 3 full months to master the same technique back in his own day, reinforcing just how exceptional his student was, and adding that the boy Qin was bringing wasn't someone certain pieces of trash should even think about challenging. Qin tried to argue back, but Zhang Lin had already hung up. He then turned to Lin Chunfeng and told him not to win too easily the next day, instructing him to make the fight look close enough to spare Qin some dignity. The next afternoon, Qin used his own power to fly me toward the Yang City training camp. I admitted I hadn't expected my first experience of actual flight to come under circumstances quite like these. We landed in the center of the courtyard, where Zhang Lin and his men were already waiting. The rival grandmaster asked what kind of genius he'd been dragged out here to meet, and Qin introduced me as a Tier 1 initial stage martial artist who fought with a spear. I greeted Zhang Lin politely, but he only stared back in irritated disbelief. Privately, though, Zhang Lin started sweating, realizing that a Tier 2 fighter against a Tier 1 opponent was effectively a guaranteed kill, meaning Lin Chuanfeng's acting was about to be put through its real test. Qin ignored the insults entirely and told his old friend to hurry things along so they could get back in time for dinner. A large crowd of trainees gathered at the Yang City arena, buzzing with excitement, many of them speculating about the visiting genius from Star City and joking that they hoped the challenger wouldn't turn out to be too weak to even bother with. Zhang Lin introduced both Qin and me to the crowd, and after an awkward smile, he announced that I was only at the Tier 1 initial stage. The local trainees burst into disbelief, visibly insulted that someone that weak would even dare to step up against them. Lin Shunfeng started sweating nervously hearing all this, since his master had specifically ordered him to make the fight look close to spare Qin's dignity. Ignoring the noise around them, Zhang Lin confirmed the terms of the bet with Qin. If his student won, Qin would owe him an A-rank martial art in return. Playing the part of a generous host, he told me that if I somehow managed to win instead, I could choose an extra A-rank technique as my own prize. I thanked him politely for the offer. Qin sarcastically called his old rival a real nice guy, clapping him on the back. Privately, though, Zhang Lin remained completely confident that a Tier 1 beginner stood no real chance against a Tier 2 student carrying a rare wood spirit body. We stepped into the arena, while the 2 grandmasters watched from the side. Zhang Lin quietly reminded Lin Chunfeng to hold back his strength, and the nervous student gripped his sword, assuring his master he'd manage it, privately panicking over his own acting, terrified he might accidentally hurt me with a single careless strike. Noticing I'd left my spear untouched, he asked why I wasn't using the weapon I'd brought with me. I stretched casually and told him I had no plans to use it for now, privately reasoning that my only real spear technique was still a basic C-crank skill. Bringing the spear into this fight would only put me at a disadvantage. Lin Chunfeng took my decision as pure arrogance rather than practicality, and the misread irritated him enough that he leapt into the air and charged, his blade wrapped in a green aura as he swung it down at me. Using my own A-rank movement technique, I glided backward across the arena. He looked genuinely shocked to see a supposed beginner pull off an A-rank wind movement skill so cleanly. Finding the situation more interesting now, he refused to let me slip away and charged again, declaring that movement techniques wouldn't save me this time before unleashing his wood prison technique. Thick, green vines erupted from the ground and wrapped tightly around my leg. I complimented him on the rarity of a genuine control-type skill. Before I even got the chance, the vines shattered apart on their own and dissolved into nothing, leaving me genuinely confused how a technique that powerful could fall apart so suddenly. He used that brief moment of distraction to appear midair behind me and confidently declaring that stopping me for even a second was all he needed to win. I wasn't rattled, glancing calmly over my shoulder as I gathered glowing wind energy around my fist, readying a quick counter. The moment I threw the wind-infused punch, He realized with alarm that it was moving too fast for his sword to land first. He scrambled, conjuring a thick wooden barrier with his wood escape technique for protection, but it proved completely useless, my punch shattering the shield into splinters and launching him backward with tremendous force. Battered and stunned, he couldn't comprehend how a supposed lower-level beginner could possess physical strength this overwhelming. The local trainees were equally shaken, watching their champion's A-rank defense get torn apart so effortlessly, the realization sinking in that my raw strength clearly surpassed even that of a wild beast. From above the arena, Qin laughed loudly, openly teasing his old rival over the sudden reversal. Zhonglin was sweating now but stayed stubborn, insisting raw strength alone wasn't going to be enough to take down his genius student. I launched forward at full speed, chasing down Lin Chunfang and driving a kick toward him, only for my leg to pass straight through him, shattering what turned out to be nothing more than an afterimage. He used his own A-rank movement skill to appear directly behind me, boasting about his footwork before unleashing an explosive sword slash, which I dodged with ease. Out of breath, he glanced across the arena and finally acknowledged the sheer scale of my strength, admitting, almost humbly, that he'd have lost easily if we'd actually been at the same level, and urged me to give up. In response, I extended my hand toward him, and bright orange flames erupted violently from my fist. Before he could react, a massive cage of fire roared to life around him, trapping him completely. He stared in disbelief, stunned that I'd managed to pull off a control-type martial art. Sweating from the heat radiating off the flames, he marveled that a supposed beginner had already mastered the flame cage, though he assumed my reserves couldn't possibly last long. Up on the platform, Qin lost his composure entirely, visibly shocked that I'd already mastered the technique. Zhenglin asked, confused, why he looked so stunned by a move he'd supposedly taught me himself. Qin fumbled for an explanation, stammering through it, while Zhonglin pressed further, demanding to know why a student with a wind attribute was suddenly throwing fire. Qin covered his own ignorance by brushing it off, claiming that having multiple elements wasn't really a big deal. He pointed back toward the fight just as Zhonglin started wondering aloud why the cage hadn't collapsed yet. I stood calmly outside the flames, gathering a swirling white fire around my fist. From inside the prison, Lin Chunfang watched in horror, realizing I was somehow maintaining the cage while simultaneously preparing another attack, a feat even Tier 3 martial artists typically struggled to pull off. Confirming exactly what he feared, I surged forward and drove my glowing fist straight through the flames. In a panic, summoning thick wooden roots to shield himself, but the defense did nothing. My fist tore straight through the wood and slammed into his stomach, and he coughed up blood. My fist smashed brutally into his chest, and he coughed up blood as the force sent him flying backward into the scorching walls of the flame cage, severely burning his bare back. Almost instantly, a bright green energy flared across the burns, rapidly healing the damaged skin. With a confident smirk, he told me I shouldn't underestimate his healing power as a Tier 2 wood spirit boy. Hearing that, I wondered what exactly he meant, whether it was tied to some kind of unique physique. I covered the distance and unleashed a flurry of punches, curious how much it would actually take to overwhelm his recovery. He kept taunting through every hit, insisting the effort was pointless, since no Tier 1 fighter's stamina could ever outlast a Tier 2's. He gathered a dense spear of green energy in his free hand and challenged me, openly curious whether my flame cage would collapse first, or his own recovery would give out before that. Sensing my fire energy running dangerously low, I stopped attacking, knowing the cage could collapse on its own and leave me exposed if I waited too long. I canceled it myself. As the flames dissolved, he laughed in triumph, assuming I'd given up, declaring it was now his turn to attack. That confidence didn't last. His smile vanished. I mentioned, almost casually, that I hadn't planned on using this particular move, since it drained far too much energy. He stared at the power gathering in my palm, breaking into a cold sweat, stunned that a mere Tier 1 fighter could produce something this monstrous. Panicking, he knew he couldn't afford to let me get close. A massive wall of thick wooden pillars erupted from the ground to shield him. My eyes flared with intense golden light. I stepped up to the towering wall, pulled back my fist, and drove it forward with everything I had, the air itself warping around the impact as the strike tore straight through the wood like it was paper. The punch caught him square in the face, sending his unconscious body crashing to the floor. I stood quietly among the dying flames and scattered debris. A stunned silence swept over the crowd. The Yang City trainees broke into panicked disbelief, horrified that their champion had been knocked out in a single strike, despite his Tier 2 healing ability. Zhonglin broke into a cold sweat, turning to his old rival and demanding to know what kind of monster Qin had actually brought to his camp. Trembling, he pointed at the arena, realizing I'd used attribute fusion to pull off that level of destruction, amazed that a tier 1 fighter this young had already mastered something so advanced. Chin sipped his tea innocently, remarking that he definitely wouldn't be mentioning that I'd mastered dual attribute fusion in just 1 month. Kin glanced away and added, almost offhandedly, that if his rival knew I had 100% compatibility with all 7 elements and was cultivating all 7 guiding techniques simultaneously, he probably dropped dead from the shock alone. Putting on a show of clumsiness, he cheerfully apologized for letting the secret slip, though the smug look on his face made it clear he didn't regret it in the slightest. Zhang Lin stood frozen, his mind struggling to process how a student could pull off feats this absurd in the span of a single month. Qin threw an arm around his stunned rival and brought up their bet, reminding him that since I'd won the match, he now owed me instruction in the A-rank Thunder Spirit art along with his ultimate technique, the Palm Thunder. Sometime later, inside a massive dome-shaped training room, Zhang Lin and I stood across from each other in a high-tech arena, privately admitting to himself that he'd never encountered anyone quite like me in his entire life. Setting his shock aside, he introduced the technique he was about to demonstrate, an A-rank Thunder Spear art called the 9 Heaven-Breaking Spears. Blue lightning crackled violently around his grip as he explained that the art consisted of 3 stances, each containing 3 unique moves, 9 in total, with both the destructive power and difficulty rising sharply with every stance. He admitted he wouldn't normally teach something like this to anyone below tier 4, but given how rare my talent was, he felt confident I could pick up the first stance without much trouble. He told me to watch closely as his eyes began to glow, then unleashed the first stance, River Overturning, sending a massive wave of pure lightning crashing down vertically through the arena. Moving smoothly into the second, he announced Sea and Birding, sweeping his spear to summon a huge surge of lightning that rolled across the room like a raging ocean. I gripped my own weapon tightly, watching the display unfold, feeling almost like a tiny boat lost at sea inside the storm, aware that even a single stray bolt could capsize me entirely. Without pausing, he moved straight into the third stance, Heaven Breaking, thrusting his spear forward and releasing a piercing blast of lightning. The residual energy from that final strike whipped up a terrifying tornado of swirling electricity. Watching the storm rage, I realized he'd clearly held back significantly, careful not to destroy the room around us. Even feeling like little more than an ant standing in front of him, I felt my resolve harden, determined that one day I'd possess combat power on that same level. As the storm finally settled, he handed me a small manual detailing the 9 heaven-breaking spears, telling me to practice on my own first and offering to answer any questions if something didn't make sense. I thanked him respectfully for his guidance, but he just smiled warmly, telling me there was no need, since he was simply honoring the bet.
Yeah, boy.
He promised that once I mastered the first stance, he'd move on to teaching me his second technique, Palm Thunder, casually adding that as strong as the spear art was, it still fell well short of his ultimate technique in terms of raw power. I held the manual tightly, genuinely excited at the thought that Palm Thunder might be even more powerful than what I'd just witnessed, and resolved to work through this spear art as quickly as I could. With a wave of his hand, Zhang Lin turned to leave the dome, mentioning he had matters to discuss with Qin and promising to check back in soon to see how my practice was going. After about an hour passed, the Grand Master opened the door, telling me not to push myself too hard, since the technique usually took a month or 2 to grasp. Instead, he found me already performing the exact stance he'd shown me earlier, my spear lighting up with thunder. The moment I noticed him, I told him it had been difficult, but I'd already managed to reach the basic level, and asked him to teach me the next one. He stood there dumbfounded, visibly wondering if this was really just talent or something closer to a monster's growth rate. As evening fell, Zhang Lin sat there looking thoroughly drained, like someone who'd just been put through the ringer. When Qin finally returned, he asked why Zhang Lin was just sitting there if he'd already taught me Palm Thunder. Zhang Lin told him I had, in fact, already learned it. Qin couldn't quite believe it, hoping his old friend wasn't exaggerating since a technique like that was notoriously difficult to grasp. But the moment he looked inside, he saw me performing it himself, sweat dripping down my face as I confirmed it. He let out a heavy breath, admitting that even though he'd mentally prepared himself for surprises, he hadn't expected this. Zhang Lin mentioned that in his own time, it had taken him 3 full months to learn it, and his own teacher had praised him as a genius for that. Zhang Lin told Qin he was confident I'd eventually reach tier 9. Seeing the state I was in, Qin offered to treat me to a meal, then mentioned he was heading out for drinks himself, leaving instructions for the camp's teaching assistant to arrange whatever I needed before we left the next day. Night fell quickly once we got back to the training camp dormitory. I checked my system interface and noticed noted that defeating Tanhua's group in Lin Shenfang had earned me 230 martial Dao points total. My vitality was still far too low, and my spiritual power, physique, and martial arts all still needed continued investment. 230 points wasn't nearly enough to cover everything I needed. Since I believed the cultivation realm was the true foundation underneath everything else, I decided to prioritize raising my vitality first, though I realized I'd need an entirely new way to keep earning martial Dao value going forward. With no one left in camp willing to spar with me, my only real option was to head back to the ferocious beast room and keep farming kills there. Meanwhile, the two grandmasters were out drinking together. Zhang Lin complained that Qin was shameless for scamming him out of 2 A-ranks martial arts in one visit, but Qin just brushed it off, admitting he'd heard that particular complaint 100 times already. They were interrupted by a staff member announcing that the camp's night raid event was about to begin. Zhang Lin casually gave the go-ahead, telling the man not to go easy on the trainees, and the order was relayed to drill them without mercy. Qin sobered up almost instantly, panicking as he realized the raid was happening that very night and that I was currently staying in those same dormitories.
Yeah, boy.
Recognizing the scale of the mistake, Zhang Lin tried to postpone the operation, but it was already too late. The notification had gone out, and the instructors had already begun their hunt. Outside, a team of masked raiders assembled. Bu Jingfeng, who had already been humiliated by me once before, asked his brother, Bu Jinglong, why a Tier 2 high-stage martial artist like him was even bothering with something as simple as a night raid. Jingwang explained that Zhang Lin had specifically requested him to handle a wood spirit body trainee with strong recovery abilities. He remarked dryly that the Grandmaster was essentially just having him bully a kid stuck at Tier 2 initial stage, but paused mid-sentence. Admitting the description sounded oddly familiar, smirking, he teased his brother about getting counter-killed during a previous night raid, telling him he'd embarrassed the entire family with that performance. Flustered, Jingfang defended himself, insisting he'd simply underestimated his opponent and vowing to finish the job if their paths ever crossed again. Jinglong mocked him further, asking if beating someone stuck at Tier 1 initial stage was really something worth bragging about in the first place, then ordered everyone to pull their hoods up and move out. The peace of the dorm shattered as the masked instructors launched their ambush, smashing through the doors. The commotion pulled my attention immediately, and looking out, I realized a full night raid was already underway. One instructor was busy punching a student who hadn't even had time to get dressed, the kid shouting at him for having no martial virtue. The masked man eventually noticed me and lunged, clearly surprised they'd somehow missed a student during the first sweep. Before he could react, I drove an uppercut into him hard enough to send him crashing straight through the ceiling and into the rafters. With him stuck up there, I lit a flame in my hand, genuinely irritated, since I wasn't even technically a student here. Looking over the Raiders' dark hooded outfit though, an idea hit me. If I switched into one of these uniforms and passed myself off as a Raider, I could openly take down students for massive martial Dao value without anyone questioning it. A sly grin crept onto my face. Down the hall, a student begged the masked instructor to at least let him put his boxers on first, but the Raider just laughed, telling him to stay still and take the hit. That was when I burst into the room in disguise, announcing I'd come to help. The actual instructor turned around, confused, asking what I was doing there since he was the one assigned to that section. Without a word, I punched him straight through the concrete wall. The student stared in disbelief, baffled at the sight of the Raiders apparently turning on each other. I dashed off immediately, declaring I was about to rack up hundreds of points that night, leaving the half-dressed student wondering why he'd been spared. Thrilled, I ran down the hall with my fist already burning, realizing that since every Raider here was high tier, I finally had an excuse to stop holding back entirely. I tore through trainees and Raiders alike without distinction, beating them down until the Raiders themselves started screaming that there was a mole hidden in their ranks. After launching another opponent off into the distance, I confirmed the first floor was cleared and moved straight up to the second. There, I moved like a golden blur, unleashing a storm of strikes that dropped anyone unlucky enough to be in my path. As I pushed toward the third floor, I couldn't help laughing, feeling like I genuinely struck gold. On the third floor, a cluster of masked instructors stood watching an intense fight unfold between Lin Chunfang and Bu Jinglong, visibly impressed by how terrifyingly resilient the student's recovery ability was, though they warned that things could turn dangerous for Jinglong if the fight dragged on much longer. I walked right up to the group and asked, casually, why so many of them were just standing around blocking the way. They explained that the other students had already been dealt with, and only the wood spirit body trainee remained. I stepped forward, golden energy igniting around my fist, and told them there was no real reason to keep watching. They asked, confused, what exactly I thought I was doing. Before any of them could react, I tore through the entire group, mentioning offhandedly that I'd already dealt with the wood spirit body once before. The sudden chaos interrupted the main fight entirely, and Jinglong, equally confused, asked why I was attacking my own comrades. I flared my golden aura and challenged the whole group to come at me together. Jinglong told Chunfang to stand down for the moment, promising he'd finish him off once he dealt with me first. He charged forward, declaring that as a raider, I should have been focused on my own assigned targets instead of interfering. I calmly raised my fist to meet him. The instant our blows collided, a powerful shockwave tore through the air. My punch completely absorbed his strike, leaving him visibly stunned, the force nearly shattering his arm and sending him stumbling backward in disbelief. Seeing me rushing toward him again, he abandoned any thought of fighting alone and shouted for Chunfang to team up with him against what he called a complete madman. Chunfang agreed instantly. He unleashed his wood prison technique, trying to restrain me, but I dodged the vines before they could close in. While I was focused on that, Jinglong tried to sneak in from behind, but I activated my Earth Attribute battle armor just in time. He looked genuinely taken aback that I'd managed to stop a Tier 2 high-stage attack, clearly wondering where this unfamiliar threat had even come from. A moment later, he lost track of me entirely. He scanned the room frantically, and before he could locate me, I appeared right behind him and slammed him into a wall, the impact nearly making him sick on the spot. I turned to Chunfang next, appearing above him without warning and driving a punch straight into the ground, knocking him out cold in a single hit. Taking both of them down earned me 140 martial Dao points for Jinglong and 70 for Chunfang. Checking my totals afterward, I realized the night's chaos had netted me over 2,400 points overall. The next day, the entire Yang City camp, students and raiders alike, were left nursing their injuries. Zhang Lin blamed Qin for bringing his monstrous student and throwing the whole camp into disarray. Fed up, he practically threw us both out of his camp, and Qin scooped me up like cargo as we lifted into the air. On the way out, he asked if I had any metal, wood, or water attribute martial arts. I told him I didn't, and the old man immediately started plotting to run the same scam on his other old friends to get me exactly what I needed. Over the following days, he dragged me through 3 different training camps. Using the same tactic each time, I walked away with 3 brand new A-rank techniques. Back at Star City's training camp, I sat down and started absorbing the 3 skills Ken had helped me scam. Within minutes, I'd mastered all 3 at beginner level. And looking back on everything, I genuinely couldn't believe how many A-rank techniques I'd accumulated at this point. With nearly 3,000 martial Dao points banked, I decided it was time to push my vital blood higher. I funneled most of my points into vital blood, and the sudden surge nearly tore my muscles apart from the strain. Once everything settled, my body returned to normal, and my vital blood had climbed all the way to 450, putting me just 50 points away from breaking through to Tier 2. With only 100 martial Dao points left, I weighed where to put them, between strengthening my spirit or pushing further into my overlord physique. After thinking it over, I went with physique, only to find the return disappointing. A full 100 points barely moved the needle by 0.1%. Realizing how brutally difficult that particular stat was to raise, I decided to leave it alone for the time being and instead focus everything on finally breaking through to Tier 2. My plan was to head back to the ferocious beast room and farm enough points to get there. On my way out, I ran into Qin, who immediately asked if I happened to know any healing martial arts.
Yeah, boy.
The moment he asked, I knew exactly what he was up to. Sure enough, he brought me to the Hang City training camp to join their special wilderness training program. Students would need to survive 7 days in the 10,000 Demon Mountain range without any supplies, earning contribution points only by defeating beasts equal to or stronger than themselves. Given that Hang City sat in the provincial capital, it made sense their camp was packed with genuine prodigies. After the announcement, Wang Tianshan ordered everyone to move out, and the students leapt into the mountains without hesitation. Once they'd gone, he turned to Qin and asked if he still dared to place a bet, fully aware that I hadn't even broken through to Tier 2 yet. Qin assured him he was confident, then restated the terms of the bet. If I won, Wang Tianshan would have to teach me an A-rank healing martial art. If I lost, Qin promised to teach an A-rank technique to every single student who managed to beat me. Trying to spare him the embarrassment, he suggested they just drop the bet entirely and let me experience the mountain range's horrors firsthand instead. Qin grew uneasy hearing that the beasts roaming the area were tied to the myriad race's demon cult, but Wang Tianshan brushed it off, assuring him they were only low-level Tier 2 and Tier 3 threats. Qin remained unconvinced, accusing him of trying to work the students into early graves by exposing them to a Tier 3 beast linked to the demon cult. Wang Tianshan defended the training as necessary, insisting it was the only way to prepare them for how brutal the myriad races war had become. Unable to talk him out of it, Qin gave up trying to reason with him and decided to simply watch how things played out, privately hoping I'd prioritize survival over chasing first place. As it turned out, his worry was misplaced. I tore through the 10,000 demon mountain range without much trouble. By nightfall, I faced down a giant tiger and finished it off using water dragon. As impressive as these newly learned techniques were, I quickly realized they drained an enormous amount of internal spiritual energy. Once I'd gathered enough martial Dao points, I went looking for a secluded cave where I could safely attempt my breakthrough to Tier 2. Inside, I began channeling the 500 points I'd collected into my vital blood, setting the breakthrough process in motion. While I was deep in concentration, a stranger wandered near the cave, grumbling about being stuck running some kind of errand. It quickly became clear his group was preparing a sacrifice somewhere deeper in the mountain range. I stumbled across the corpse of a beast nearby and immediately suspected someone might be hiding inside the cave. Approaching the entrance, he called out, ordering whoever was inside to come out and accept a quick death, his eyes flicking toward the remains of the Tier 2 red flame black tiger nearby. He assumed his opponent had to possess at least Tier 3 strength to have taken something like that down. From inside the cave, I listened to his arrogant tone, and given how dismissively he spoke about Tier 3 martial artists, I started to suspect I might actually be dealing with a Tier 4 expert. Despite having just broken through to Tier 2 myself, I knew I didn't have the confidence to take on someone at that level. My priority shifted entirely to getting out of the cave alive, so I launched a water dragon attack to cover my escape. He gripped his sword eagerly and shattered the watery construct with a single slash, mocking it as having barely the power of an early Tier 2 martial artist. Spotting me trying to flee, he gave chase immediately, calling me a genius for managing to kill a red flame black tiger at such a low level, adding with a sadistic grin that he took particular pleasure in strangling promising geniuses while they were still young. Then he stopped mid-pursuit, confused, asking why I'd suddenly stopped running. I turned to face him and told him plainly that judging from the vitality he'd just put on display, he was actually only at Tier 3 initial stage, far below what I'd originally assumed. That was when I noticed a distinct tattoo on his neck, marking him as belonging to the heavenly god race, confirming he was a member of the myriad race's demon cult, human traders who viewed their own humanity as something shameful and captured people to offer as sacrifices to the myriad races in exchange for rewards. Disgusted, I let a golden aura flare around me and told him that anyone had the right to be the one who ended him. He smirked, daring me to try, and launched an A-rank technique, the Heavenly Sun Slash. Facing a genuine Tier 3 opponent for the first time, I knew I needed to commit fully. I answered with River Overturning, a massive wave of golden lightning that crashed into his attack and dispersed it completely in a single exchange. I was honestly surprised, wondering how a supposed Tier 3 martial artist could fold that easily against my technique. He panicked, unable to process how he'd ended up at a disadvantage against someone a full realm below him, despite using an A-rank technique of his own, and equally baffled that I could wield both water and thunder attributes, and threw himself into a frantic flurry of sword strikes, all of which I dodged with ease before vanishing with a burst of movement and reappearing directly behind him. I prepared to unleash another blast, treading sea, this one carrying even more force than my last attack. Realizing it dwarfed his own Heavenly Sun Slash, he panicked and tried to retreat, but thick green vines erupted from the ground first, my wood attribute control technique locking his leg in place. He stared in utter disbelief, stunned that I'd somehow added a wood attribute on top of water and thunder, completely immobilized as the full force of the lightning blast swallowed him whole. As the dust settled, I stared at the smoldering remains, only for the body to suddenly begin melting into the ground, sparking immediate concern that he might be escaping through some kind of movement technique. Sure enough, he reformed nearby, his body now wrapped in thick rock armor, cursing his luck for running into a monster instead of the human genius he'd expected. I told him there was nowhere left for him to run. In response, he prepared his counterattack, his body transforming as massive wings sprouted from his back, demanding I feel the divine might of the heavenly god race. I thrust my spear forward and mocked him for mutating into something this grotesque, telling him plainly that this demonic cult had to be completely insane. He caught the spear tip with his bare armored hand, bragging that once he finished his bloodline modification, he'd become a true member of the heavenly god race, declaring his sacrificial ritual wouldn't tolerate any interruption. I retaliated immediately, unleashing a fierce blast of fire that pierced straight through one of his wings. With the opening created, I activated my flame cage technique, trapping him inside a blazing prison. Then I channeled pure lightning into my spear and executed the final stance of the 9 heaven-breaking spears, the crackling weapon tearing straight through his rock armor and delivering a devastating, explosive blow. He managed to gasp out the word monster before his mutated body shattered completely. Checking my system afterward, I'd earned 212 martial Dao points for the kill, confirming that hunting these fanatics was far more lucrative than grinding through ordinary beasts. Remembering his mention of a sacrifice, I quickly pieced together that they'd captured humans somewhere nearby and knew I needed to alert the Grand Masters immediately. Back at the Hang City camp, Qin checked his phone and relayed the report to Wang Tianshan, mentioning the demonic cult's presence and the sacrificial ritual underway. Wang Tianshan calmly sipped his tea, replying that if the captives turned out to be the cult's own members, there was no reason to bother getting involved. He asked why Qin was still sitting there drinking tea instead of rushing to save his student. Qin replied, just as calmly, that I'd already killed the Tier 3 initial stage cultist myself. Wang Tianshan scoffed outright, refusing to believe a Tier 1 trainee could have defeated an opponent like that, accusing Qin of bragging. 3 days later, I'd taken down a fair number of Tier 3 beasts, though I hadn't crossed paths with another cult member. My total martial Dao value sat at 682, a number that would never climb as fast through ordinary beast kills as it had through cultists. Then my senses picked up on something nearby. A blue-haired woman with black wing tattoos across her back stood perched on a branch above me, playfully praising the handsome little brother who'd managed to find her. Gathering sharp ice energy into her palm, she offered a seductive smile before declaring, almost cheerfully, that since I'd barged into their territory, all I could do now was die. She unleashed a rapid volley of deadly ice spikes straight at me. The cult had practically delivered martial Dao value right to my doorstep, and I couldn't help the confident smile spreading across my face. I blocked her attack with Water Dragon, but as a thick fog rolled in around me, she tried to catch me off guard from behind with her whip. I grabbed it just in time, already deciding I'd use her to find out where the rest of her group was hiding. I yanked the whip and pulled her toward me, leaving her too stunned to resist, then slammed her into the ground with a bone nether flame fist. I demanded she give up the location of the Myriad Race's demon cult. She gave it up without hesitation, reciting the coordinates and promising to tell me everything as long as I spared her life. I asked how many Tier 3 martial artists were stationed at the stronghold. She told me there were 3 total, herself included, along with 3 additional Tier 2 fighters. Since I'd already taken out the red-haired man earlier, plus her now, that meant only 1 Tier 3 opponent likely remained. With just 1 serious threat left standing between me and the rest of their stronghold, I started planning to wipe the whole place out and rake in thousands of martial Dao points in the process, enough to push my telekinesis through its next breakthrough. While I was busy mentally calculating my future point total, she broke free of my grip, mocking me for underestimating her and swearing she'd never let me walk away from this. She transformed into her mutated celestial form right in front of me, looking like some grotesque hybrid of a human and a bat. Before she could finish her monologue, my thunder spear had already punched straight through her chest. I told her, pulling the spear free, that her cult had committed far too many horrors for me to let even a single one of them walk away clean. With that, I finished her off, telling her to go ahead and contribute to my growing martial Dao total. The kill earned me a little over 200 points, and I was thoroughly satisfied with the haul. Deep within the mountain, the demon cult had gathered around their sacrificial altar, surrounding a group of captured geniuses from the Hang City training camp. One of the captives cursed under his breath, regretting having trusted a cultist who'd claimed the stronghold only held 3 people total, all supposedly Tier 2. Looking at the crowd now assembled around them, every single one was actually Tier 3. Moments later, the commander, addressing himself as Blood, ordered his people to begin the sacrifice. It turned out the 3 captives were all mid-stage Tier 2. And if there was one thing the Myriad Race's demon cult despised above all else, it was genuine talent. Despite knowing they were almost certainly doomed, the trio refused to go down without a fight, vowing to take as many cultists with them as they could. Meanwhile, their actual masters, Wang Tianshan and Qin, were watching the entire scene unfold from a distance. Qin admitted he was genuinely impressed that they were willing to risk their lives against more than a dozen Tier 3 cultivators. He decided to let the fight play out a little longer before stepping in. Qin told him they might not even need to step in, having already noticed me sprinting toward the sacrificial stronghold. Wang Tianshan, assuming Qin had to be losing his grip on reality, told him to stop daydreaming, refusing to accept that a so-called Tier 1 trash student could possibly save anyone from a group of Tier 3 martial artists. Meanwhile, the 3 captured geniuses were still holding their ground. One of them told the other 2 to run while he stayed behind as bait to buy them time, but they refused to leave him behind. Just as the cultists leapt forward to finish them off, that was the moment a lightning spear cut through the air and saved them at the last possible second, practically carving a trench through the ground and splitting the cultists away from the group entirely. An eerie silence settled over everyone as they processed the bizarre scene playing out in front of them. Unable to see who'd thrown it, the cultists scanned the area for the source, but before they could find anything, I dropped out of nowhere and started crushing them with the palm thunder technique. Within moments, I tore through the entire group like a blur, leaving behind nothing but scattered lightning and body. Once I'd cleared them out, I checked on the trio, though they were too stunned to even speak at first. One of them recognized me immediately as the unhinged powerhouse from Star City's training camp, and the other praised me for taking down several Tier 3 martial artists in the blink of an eye. Watching from a distance, Wang Tianshan was starting to come around, genuinely puzzled how I'd managed to use Palm Thunder at all, since he'd assumed, based on Qin's earlier request to teach me a healing technique, that I worked with wood attribute skills. Even Qin couldn't offer an explanation, too stunned watching me chain Palm Thunder together repeatedly, the only logical conclusion being that I'd already broken through to Tier 2. What really threw him was the timeline, since I'd still been early stage Tier 1 when I first arrived at the camp, and only high stage Tier 1 by the time I left for this special mission. With only a handful of days having passed since he'd last seen me, he genuinely struggled to make sense of how fast my cultivation was moving. Back at the stronghold, I told the trio to clear out while I handled the rest. They obeyed immediately, though not without warning me to be careful. What they didn't realize was that I was actually rushing them off the premises to keep them from accidentally cutting into my points. At first, I was genuinely irritated that the woman from earlier had lied about the actual head count, but that irritation quickly gave way to a wicked grin. I already knew each kill was worth a little over 200 martial Dao points, and there were easily over a dozen of them left standing. While I quietly savored the math, they charged at me, screaming and cursing the whole way, and I let myself enjoy the moment privately as I crushed them without much effort, leaving nothing behind but a trail of blood. I turned to finish off the rest with Palm Thunder, but by then, they were too terrified to fight back, begging for their lives instead. I didn't grant any of them mercy, and their screams echoed through the forest as they called out for their commander to save them. The commander, though, ignored all of it entirely. Once he reached the top, he declared proudly to whatever remained of his followers that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Then the blood pooling from every corpse around the altar began converging toward its center, leaving me genuinely confused about what I was witnessing. I watched as the blood completely consumed him, and I figured this had to be the actual sacrifice they'd been talking about all along. A few minutes later, an actual celestial being calling himself Tanming descended in the aftermath of the blood ritual. He mocked me immediately, asking why I wasn't kneeling before the noble celestial race. I looked him over like a fresh cut of meat on a chopping block, already excited at the thought of how many martial Dao points an actual celestial might be worth. He soon noticed me staring, and immediately took it as an insult. To teach me a lesson for my insolence, he attacked without warning. I'll admit, the speed caught me off guard. Before I could fully react, he drove a powerful punch toward me, which I managed to block, though just barely. He seemed genuinely impressed that someone this strong existed among the younger generation of humans. I had to admit, grudgingly, that this celestial really was strong. He was clearly thrilled to have run into an opponent like me, having assumed this whole possession following the cult's sacrifice would amount to little more than a routine cleanup mission against a handful of unremarkable humans. Unfortunately for him, time wasn't on his side. His body had started to break down, the vessel he was possessing apparently only Tier 4 at best, and he was already failing far faster than he'd accounted for. Still, he seemed confident it was more than enough to finish me off. While he closed the distance, I turned his words over in my head, and after a moment it clicked. He wasn't a true celestial at all. He was just a human shell being puppeted by one. That realization gave me the confidence to meet his charge head on, determined to see who'd be laughing by the end of this. What followed was a brutal back and forth, each of us trying to overpower the other. Watching from a distance like a spectator at a match, Qin marveled at how well the possessed body was holding up, noting that a celestial's physical form had to be genuinely powerful to keep pace with my strength at all. Wang Tianshan, meanwhile, was far more fixated on me than the celestial, struggling to believe I was matching an actual celestial in pure physical strength. Back in the fight, I unleashed a flurry of punches that left him struggling just to keep up his guard. The truly absurd part being that I was still a full realm below him in cultivation. A few exchanges later, I landed a final blow that sent him staggering backward. Already battered, he questioned how my physique was even possible, admitting that his strength had never once failed him, even against rated geniuses from other races. Even with his full celestial power locked behind the limits of this borrowed mortal shell, a mere human shouldn't have been capable of resisting him this long. Seeing the look on his face, I mocked him for running out of steam. Honestly, I was enjoying myself more than I had in a long time. I could finally go all out and focus purely on doing damage. Meanwhile, he kept trying to pin his weakening performance on his collapsing borrowed body. I cut him off mid-sentence, telling him I'd actually love the chance to fight his real celestial body too, since it would only make this fight even more satisfying. That comment alone seemed to push him over the edge, and enraged, he decided to bring out the real firepower. He activated his divine treasury, an ultimate skill capable of summoning a rain of divine spears straight from the sky. I'll admit, the sight genuinely mesmerized me. Those golden spears looked like they could annihilate a tier 3 martial artist without much effort. Naturally, I tried to copy the technique, but the system immediately flagged it as impossible to learn. It turned out his divine treasury was an innate celestial technique, something only those with truly pure bloodlines could wield. Watching from a distance, Qin reasoned that this man had to be someone significant among the celestials given how pure his bloodline clearly was. Wang Tianshan, already panicking on my behalf, urged Qin to forget about the man's identity and step in to save me, insisting they couldn't afford to lose a treasure like me at such a critical moment. But Qin stopped him. Wang Tianshan was floored when Qin casually mentioned, almost in passing, that I had 100% affinity across all 7 attributes and had mastered the fusion of thunder and fire while still only at early stage tier 1. Back in the fight, he prepared to finish me off, declaring that I couldn't be allowed to live, since my very existence posed too great a threat. He summoned the spears and unleashed them, declaring this would be the day I died. As the golden spears bore down on me, I stayed calm. Since he'd forced my hand, I committed fully, unleashing the third and final stance of the 9 heaven-breaking spears, heaven-shattering. A devastating bolt of lightning tore through every single spear, reducing them to nothing. That was the moment he realized he picked the wrong human to threaten. As the lightning spear bore down on him, he didn't even attempt to react, simply accepting whatever was coming without resistance, scattering his body into countless fragments. Once the dust settled, I'd earned a staggering 843 martial Dao points for taking down his mortal shell, and I was thoroughly pleased with the result. Just then, the 2 old grandmasters arrived, with Wang Tianshan immediately showering me with all kinds of overly affectionate nicknames, leaving me a little confused. Without any warning, he started squeezing and fussing over me like he'd just discovered a priceless gem, unable to wrap his head around the fact that a tier 2 martial artist had defeated an actual celestial. Honestly, I was confused by all the fuss myself. If a celestial that ordinary had pushed me to use my ultimate technique, the real geniuses of that race had to be terrifyingly strong. Both old men stared at me like I'd lost a few screws somewhere, since only the 2 of them actually understood that the celestial I'd just beaten was considered one of the true top dogs of his entire race. 4 days later, the students returned to camp after completing their full 7-day exile in the 10,000 Demon Mountain range. As usual, I claimed first place, finishing with a total over 17,000 points, while the 3 Hang City geniuses each managed just over 4,000. The gap left everyone stunned, several wondering aloud whether the scoreboard had been rigged somehow. One of the 3 I'd pulled out of the sacrificial stronghold defended me, insisting my strength was simply on another level entirely. Another one of the rescue geniuses chimed in, describing how I'd single-handedly taken down several tier 3 demon cultists in an instant. With all the commotion, people started scanning the arena looking for me, but someone explained that I was off learning an A-ranks martial art directly from Wang Tianshan. Elsewhere, I'd finished mastering the healing technique in less than a day, leaving Wang Tianshan thoroughly amazed. Qin told him not to bother being surprised anymore, since this kind of absurd progress had basically become routine for me by now. Back in the training room, I was genuinely pleased with the healing technique's effects, especially once I learned it was considered one of the most valuable healing arts around, given that it had even erased some of my old scars in the process. Afterward, I checked my stats and found I'd accumulated around 4,800 martial Dao points after the full 7 days in the wilderness. My plan was to use them to push my spirit stat up to 500 and finally break through to tier 2 in telekinesis. Meanwhile, on the celestial race's home planet, Chenming was being torn apart by the Celestial Council for losing to a mere human, mocked for getting suppressed by me even after pulling out his divine treasury. He tried to argue that there was nothing remotely human about what he'd actually faced. The council brushed this off and summoned another celestial, Tian Chang, ordering him to place a bounty on my head, instructing him to eliminate me at all costs before I became a larger threat down the line. Overly confident in his own abilities, Tianshang accepted the order with a smug grin. The council then asked if he'd located any divine artifact fragments within human territory. He admitted he hadn't found anything concrete yet, though he hinted at some promising leads. Back at Star City's training camp, Manhwa and his group had been training relentlessly, their daily sessions becoming something of a running topic across camp. Ever since I'd humiliated all three of them, they dropped the showmanship entirely, trading their old habit of strutting around camp for endless hours buried inside the gravity room and the ferocious beast room. They'd also poured every contribution point they had into pills to accelerate their growth. The effort paid off since all three broke through to Tier 2 within a month. Even Lin Xing, who'd always leaned more into looking good than grinding hard, had turned into a full-on training fanatic. All three shared one singular goal now, another shot at challenging me directly. Later, Qin returned to camp without me, and when Lind asked where I was, he explained I'd headed into the forest to train for a few more days. With the camp set to end soon, Lind grew anxious that I might not make it back in time, but Qin assured him I knew my own limits and would return right on schedule. 2 days later, I was deep in cultivation atop a mountain peak, completely unbothered by a giant serpent slowly making its way up toward me. I used my martial Dao points to push my spirit stat to 500, exactly as planned. Just as the serpent finally reached the summit and lunged to take a bite out of me, I shoved it back with nothing more than a wave of my palm, now that telekinesis had finally clicked into place properly. I casually conjured a giant spirit sword using weapon condensation and used it to carve the serpent apart effortlessly, like slicing through sausages. Watching its corpse tumble down the cliffside, I couldn't help but be impressed by just how much power Tier 2 telekinesis actually carried. With my spirit stat now significantly higher, I decided to attempt fusing 3 attributes together. Having already managed thunder and fire, I figured metal was the natural next step. The moment all 3 met though, they turned violently unstable, and before I could rein it in, the shock waves shattered the cliff beneath me. Despite the failure, I was honestly impressed. Even a failed fusion carried that much destructive force, which meant a successful one might genuinely be enough to take down a Tier 4 martial artist. On the final day of camp, I returned, and word spread instantly, sending everyone scrambling to alert the genius trio. The students buzzed with excitement, already speculating who'd come out on top in the inevitable rematch. Manhwa and his group had already approached Qin to formally request the challenge, and he simply asked if they genuinely believed they could win. The 3 of them answered in unison that they absolutely would. Just then, I walked up and asked if they were really sure they wanted to go through with it. Manhwa told me not to underestimate them, while Lin Xing proudly announced that all 3 had already broken through to Tier 2. Listening to their rundown, I almost felt bad about what I was about to do. I apologized in advance before revealing that I was also Tier 2. That admission left Manhwa and Lin Xing reeling with a flood of questions, though Xiao remained unfazed, convinced she was still a different case entirely, since beyond being Tier 2 herself, she was also a Tier 1 spirit telekinetic, only for me to crush her modest little wand effortlessly, knocking her completely off balance. I apologized again before proudly revealing that I was a spirit telekinetic too. Xiao could barely process that I was actually Tier 2, while Manhwa finally pieced together that I hadn't used anywhere close to my real strength during the original combat assessment. I then announced, to the camp at large, that every student present should attack me at once, all while privately just looking to farm a final round of martial Dao points before leaving camp for good. Seeing how genuinely terrifying I looked, the students recoiled and surrendered almost immediately. But I wasn't about to let them walk away without contributing something first. Meanwhile, Baimu and Lind cornered Qin, scolding him for never mentioning that I was also a telekinetic. Reading his expression, Baimu realized he'd been just as in the dark as everyone else. Unable to come up with anything better, Qin simply burst out laughing like a man losing his grip on reality, calling me the ultimate monster, a once-in-a-millennium anomaly, and adding that thanks to me, the human race might have finally found its savior. While I continued wiping the floor with my classmates, Baimu considered stepping in, but Lin told her to just let it play out. Suddenly, Qin sensed trouble as the Golden Rock Beast King appeared looming over the camp, announcing that their 30-day agreement had run its course and angrily demanding everyone clear off his territory. His arrival was enough to interrupt my rampage, giving everyone else a brief chance to catch their breath. Qin, furious, cursed at the creature for its disrespect, declaring they'd leave on their own terms and that the beast had no business ordering them off like that. As the situation escalated, Qin attacked the giant bird outright. He didn't let up, pressing the attack relentlessly while I watched from a distance, genuinely amazed by the raw power a Tier 7 Grandmaster could put on display. The 2 of them kept bickering through it all. As Qin yanked at a fistful of its feathers, the bird boasted smugly that it had come back by something far stronger than him. Qin remained completely unbothered. That was when a thunderous voice echoed down from above, ordering them both to stop. Out of nowhere, a dark and eerie figure materialized, revealing itself as the Lord of the Myriad Demons. Lind looked stunned, surprised realized that the King Rock actually had real ties to someone this powerful. The Lord of the Myriad Demons was apparently among the strongest beings in the entire mountain range, with even the weakest of his kind sitting at tier 9, and some reaching realms above that entirely. I could only stand there in silent awe, staring up at something this overwhelming. Being only tier 2 myself at that point, I understood clearly that the distance between me and beings like this was nothing short of heaven and earth. If something on that level ever decided to march on Star City, I knew I genuinely wouldn't be able to do anything to stop it. Still, the experience only hardened my resolve to one day reach that same height myself. The golden bird eventually retreated, muttering a promise to deal with Kin later. Qin didn't seem particularly rattled by the Demon Lord's sudden appearance, since he understood that an existing agreement between the demons and humanity meant a powerhouse like that couldn't simply attack on a whim, which meant the younger generation, myself included, remained reasonably safe for the time being. Despite the dramatic interruption, the training camp wrapped up as scheduled. I was genuinely looking forward to seeing my aunt and uncle again, fairly certain they'd been worrying themselves sick the entire time I'd been gone. Before boarding the bus, Qin Shan and Li Tu caught up with me, urging me to stay friendly with them, half joking that I was bound to become something of a celebrity once we got back to the city. I told them honestly that I held no grudge against them at all, adding that I probably would have forgotten the whole incident entirely if they hadn't brought it up themselves. We were then informed that everyone needed to head to the city lord's estate for a banquet held in honor of the students' efforts. While the rest of the group celebrated the news, I felt mostly frustrated since it meant pushing back the moment I'd finally get to see my aunt and uncle again. Meanwhile, at the estate, my aunt and uncle had already been invited to the banquet and seated at one of the high tables. They were completely stunned by the gesture, and so was everyone else in attendance. The assembled elites visibly disgusted that what they considered a pair of gutter rats had been seated among them. My aunt quietly asked my uncle if they weren't embarrassing me with how they were dressed, but he reminded her that they were already wearing their absolute best when Lee approached with a warm smile, introducing himself directly to the two of them. Their hearts nearly leapt out of their chests the moment he walked up, but he told them gently to relax, assuring them they had nothing to be nervous about. Someone suddenly grabbed my uncle's hand, and it turned out to be Wu Lin Qian, telling him I was the most talented person she'd ever seen. The other guests were completely stunned, watching both the school principal and the association president personally come over to greet my aunt and uncle. At the same time, among the city's elite, Lin Xingxie's father was busy praising the city lord, predicting that his own son would easily take first place at the training camp. Wang Ni praised the boy in turn, admitting that both Lin Xinghe and Xiao Yan had already mastered an A-rank technique, which left him visibly envious. The third man at the table, Xiao Yan's father, chimed in, arguing that compared to a barbarian god physique, a spirit master's strength held its own, and that his daughter would be the one taking first place. Lin Xing's father wasn't ready to let that slide either, countering that with his son's movement techniques, no telekinetic would be able to lay a hand on him. Wang Ni cut straight through the back and forth, declaring plainly that his own son would crush them both and claim the top spot outright. The exchange grew tense enough that the old man, watching from nearby, asked the association president if she wanted to step in and break it up. She refused, saying she had no business interrupting parents bragging about their own children. Instead, she told him that once I returned, all of them would have no choice but to go quiet. The old man looked surprised that she'd put that much faith in someone still technically early stage tier 1, but she simply told him it was a woman's intuition. Just then, someone rushed in to announce that the special transport from the training camp had arrived. The city lord called out to everyone, declaring that the pride of Star City had returned and that they should all go welcome them. A line of luxurious cars pulled up outside to receive us, and it was almost comical watching the parents' reactions once they saw their kids looking like they'd just survived a mugging. The city lord's own son looked especially rough. Lin Xinghe admitted it was his own fault for refusing to accept defeat, and the three of them turned to ask each other who could possibly have beaten all of them. Then they noticed their auras had each broken through to tier 2, and the parents started wondering aloud what kind of monster the city could have possibly produced to take down all three of their children at once, especially given how strong each of them individually was in strength, speed, and telekinesis. The trio admitted I was simply on another level entirely, telling their fathers they'd see exactly how monstrous I was for themselves soon enough. Just then, the rest of the camp students filed out and lined up in front of the bus, apparently arranged specifically to welcome me. Honestly, it just made me feel awkward. All I really wanted was to go home. Then I spotted my aunt and uncle calling out to me from the crowd. My aunt stumbled mid-step, but I caught her in midair using telekinesis before she could fall. My uncle looked stunned at the display. I asked if she was hurt, and she told me they'd just been worried sick about me the whole time I was gone. I reassured them that I was back now, and there was nothing left to worry about. The city lord stood there in shock, realizing I was already a tier 2 spirit master, finally understanding exactly why his own children had lost to me. The school principal and the association president immediately started questioning each other, since apparently neither of them had known I possessed telekinetic power either. She quickly called her staff, instructing them to start preparing contingencies, since their positions were suddenly looking far less secure. Meanwhile, the old man told his colleagues that his school, supposedly ranked last, was about to rise, openly looking forward to watching certain people scramble to compete with him for resources now. Almost immediately, other noble families started making calls, some already discussing arranging their daughters to marry me. The city lord moved fast, putting together a gift on the spot, personally calling me a dragon among men, and offering me a villa along with 3 million in cash, the bonus he claimed he'd originally set aside for the camp's first-place winner. Privately, the other families scoffed, certain he'd assumed his own son would take that spot and was now scrambling to cover for it. Still, he extended his hand to shake mine, declaring himself the one true authority in Star City and telling me that if I ever needed anything, I shouldn't hesitate to come find him. Hearing this and watching him extend his hand for a handshake, it was obvious he was making a very public play to win me over. As City Lord, refusing him outright would have been a real insult. Given that he held absolute authority over the city, getting on his bad side seemed like a genuinely poor idea, but allying with him also came with real upside. I reminded myself that I already had Qin, Wu, and even Li standing behind me, which meant there was no real way Wang Ni could force my hand against my will. After weighing everything, I took his hand, thanking him for his generosity while admitting that I actually did need his help with something. I told him directly that my aunt was suffering from a rare illness and I'd appreciate whatever assistance he could offer. Without hesitation, he turned to his assistant and ordered him to handle the matter personally, making sure she received the very best medical care available. He then asked if there was anything else I wanted, adding that he respected men who spoke plainly. I decided to take advantage of the moment and told him I'd like a solid weapon. Without missing a beat, he told me to follow him to the armory and pick whatever I liked. Privately, he was more than willing to give me anything I asked for, reasoning that the more he handed over, the deeper my obligation to him would run. I told my aunt and uncle to wait while I followed him there. He left the rest of the celebration to Tanwo, and watching how attentively my guardians were being treated, the other elites quietly concluded that my family standing was about to climb fast. At the armory, he showed me where the A rank and B rank weapons were kept, telling me to choose freely. I was honestly surprised by how much he was willing to sacrifice just to win my favor, given that a single A rank alloy weapon was worth hundreds of millions on its own. I asked if he had any multi-attribute alloy weapons, and that caught him off guard, prompting him to ask if I was actually a multi-attribute martial practitioner myself. I told him proudly that I could handle multiple attributes, demonstrating a little to prove it, and mentioned that Qin himself had advised me to choose a multi-attribute weapon specifically. That nearly sent him over the edge, realizing I was capable of handling all 7 attributes, which was exactly the reaction I'd hoped for, since the more talent I revealed, the more value he placed on keeping me close. He also seemed genuinely stunned by how fast my cultivation was progressing, given that multi-attribute training was supposed to drastically slow someone down. Completely overwhelmed, he admitted he couldn't fathom how someone like me had been born in a place as ordinary as Star City. His expression shifted to disappointment as he explained that true multi-attribute alloy weapons were exceedingly rare, leaving him with only a handful of dual-attribute pieces in his collection. He dug through the armory and eventually pulled out a B-rank black gold iron spearhead, the only weapon he owned capable of handling 3 attributes at once. Wang Ni asked if I wanted him to break apart an A-rank alloy spear shaft so it could be paired with the new spearhead, but I told him there was no need, since my existing fire spear shaft would do the job just fine. I was already pleased with the choice, figuring 3 attributes was more than enough, given my current strength. He then mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. Worldly anomalies had started appearing near the city, along with rumors of dual and even multi-attribute ferocious beasts roaming the area. Curious, I asked him to explain further. He told me that while I'd been away at the training camp, several strange phenomena had occurred around the world, including the emergence of multi-attribute natural treasures alongside the beasts. He mentioned a specific account of a thunder attribute beast that had started spewing both thunder and flame after coming into contact with some kind of shard-like object. On top of that, reports had surfaced of multi-attribute beasts being spotted outside the city near a location called Stargazing Lake. He warned the lake was far too dangerous to approach right now, though he reassured me I'd have access to proper multi-attribute weapons once I eventually enrolled at a martial arts university, so there was no real need to rush into unnecessary risks in the meantime. I thanked him for the guidance. A few hours later, the residents in our neighborhood were left stunned watching an official vehicle pull into the area, immediately recognizing it as one belonging exclusively to the city lord. The same rude woman who'd once tried to buy my registration slot was standing among the onlookers, openly wishing it had been her own child who'd brought a car like that home. Still bitter over my having turned her down, she muttered to herself that she was going to raise the rent on our house and force my family out the first chance she got. She hadn't even finished the thought when the car door opened and my aunt, uncle, and I stepped out, leaving every jaw in the crowd hanging open, since this was the absolute last outcome anyone had expected. My uncle walked straight up to her and informed her, plainly, that Reed been given a villa and would be moving out the next day. She stood there in shock as he added that Reed need the remaining rent balance settled. My aunt, though, told him not to bother collecting it, since our family had more than enough money now.
Women.
As we walked back into the house, he even suggested bringing the old tables and chairs along to the new place, but she told him to stop being so frugal, reminding him that I was a big shot now, and we genuinely lacked for nothing anymore. Later that night, I headed up to the roof to cultivate as usual, and realizing it would likely be my last time doing so there. After finishing my spirit point upgrades, I still had just over 1900 points left, which I used to push my vital blood through to mid-stage tier 2. Once that settled, I decided to look into the anomalies Wang Mi had mentioned earlier. I grabbed my phone and nearly crushed it in my grip, a clear sign my body hadn't fully adjusted to my new mid-stage tier 2 strength yet. Scrolling through articles on the anomalies, I found accounts describing situations serious enough that grandmasters had been forced to step in personally, underscoring just how severe the whole situation had become. One article in particular noted that every martial artist who'd witnessed the mysterious shard up close had since died under circumstances no one could explain. This left me weighing my options carefully. Even though I knew I likely couldn't beat a tier 4 martial artist outright, I was fairly confident I could at least escape one if things went south. With that settled, I decided I'd check out Stargazing Lake the following day once we finished moving into the villa. The next day, our family was flooded with gifts from our new neighbors, so many that we genuinely worried we wouldn't have room to store them all. It was obvious enough that these wealthy neighbors were just angling to stay on my good side. Several even insisted I should feel free to stop by their homes whenever I wanted, and I nervously agreed just to keep things polite. After a long, exhausting morning of fielding visitors, I finally got some breathing room and was relieved I'd still have time that afternoon to head out to the lake. At the martial artist base, I was surprised by how crowded it was, having assumed most martial artists would be out at Stargazing Lake, given everything happening there. It turned out the base was packed with Tier 1 practitioners too scared to go outside, fully aware they had no real way to defend themselves if any of the Tier 3 or Tier 4 fighters at the lake decided to rob them on the way. Meanwhile, on the base's upper floor, White Fox's uncle, Yachi, was questioning a strange man, asking if he was certain I was the one who'd killed his nephew. The man answered calmly that he was completely certain, then stood and let an overwhelming aura roll off him, forcing Yachi to his knees instantly. He warned him to watch his tone and address him properly from now on as sir. Later that day, I made my way to Stargazing Lake, keeping myself well hidden as I approached. The place was crawling with Tier 2 and Tier 3 martial artists, and even a few Tier 4s. While I watched from cover, a star-spotted giant fish, a Tier 3 beast, suddenly surged up out of the lake, sending everyone scrambling. It turned out to be a dual-attribute water cannon type, and the Tier 2 fighters present immediately fled. A defensive type Tier 4 martial artist stayed behind to block its attack, boasting confidently about his own defense, only to have it overwhelmed entirely, the beast managing to injure him in the process. I was genuinely surprised watching a Tier 4's defense crack that easily. Just then, another Tier 4 fighter appeared out of nowhere and lunged straight at the creature, practically buzzing with excitement about finally getting to face a beast of that caliber. He landed a punch that slammed it straight to the ground, then pounced on it once it was out of the water, and within a minute, the two of them had completely torn it apart. They cut the carcass open afterward, only to find no treasure inside whatsoever, much to their disappointment. I stood there in disbelief, watching a Tier 3 beast get reduced to sashimi in under 60 seconds. That alone told me these Tier 4 fighters were operating on an entirely different level of violence. Suddenly, I sensed an attack coming from behind. Just as it closed in on my neck, I activated my telekinetic ability to slow the attacker down, using the brief window to throw myself out of the way. Feeling the pressure of the attack, I realized I was being targeted by a Tier 4 martial artist. I didn't waste a second putting distance between us, fully aware that I'd have died if I hadn't used my power to slow him down at the last moment. Before I could even fully process the threat, I noticed he wasn't alone. 6 Tier 3 martial artists were already backing him up. As if that weren't enough, another 7 Tier 3s were closing in from the opposite direction. I genuinely couldn't believe it. More than a dozen Tier 3 fighters and a Tier 4 heavyweight, all apparently after my head. Running through the situation, I realized even the city lord didn't command this kind of reach, which left me wondering exactly who I'd managed to offend. Moments later, the assassins were already grumbling about how fast I was, since whatever intel they'd been given clearly hadn't accounted for the martial arts I was capable of. Still, they seemed confident I couldn't outlast them in a war of attrition. Little did they know, I had no intention of playing that game at all. I leapt into the air, right in front of them, and simply flew off, leaving them all standing in the dust, utterly stunned that a Tier 2 martial artist could fly in the first place. Once I put a solid distance between us, I finally came to a stop, and my mana was running on fumes. At that point, the only thing I really had left was the sheer durability of my overlord body. I turned the situation over in my head, trying to figure out who could possibly want me dead, and the only name that came to mind was Yachi. My best guess was that he'd paid a substantial sum to hire assassins just to get rid of me. While I was fairly confident I could handle the Tier 3 fighters on their own, the real problem was the Tier 4 martial artist looming over all of it. Going after the Tier 3s first risked leaving my back open to an ambush from him. Going after him first risked taking enough damage that the Tier 3s could close in and finish me off while I was vulnerable. The only real path forward, I reasoned, was eliminating the Tier 3s fast enough that I'd still have something left to throw at the Tier 4 before he could capitalize on my exhaustion. Meanwhile, the assassins were furious about the intel they'd been handed. They warned their boss, the Tier 4 leading the group, that things would get ugly if I made it back to the city. Even that wasn't their biggest concern though, since their actual employer posed a far scarier problem if they came back having failed. Their leader brushed off the worry, assuring them there was nothing to panic about, since even if I did make it back, it would only mean I'd die a little later than planned. Just then, the celestial agents appeared in the distance, telling the assassins not to be too upset about the outdated intel, explaining they'd only just discovered the day before that I was a Tier 2 mental telekinetic, which was why the update hadn't reached them in time. Still, they assured the group this actually worked in their favor, since they had people stationed at every anomaly site and planned to lock down the entire area. From here, it was on the assassins to finish the job, and if they failed, they should expect to pay for it with their own lives. The Tier 4 fighter thanked them for the help and promised he'd personally tear me apart. The next day, I kept hunting through the forest while the assassins trailed behind, tracking my movements. This continued for the better part of a week. While I focused on taking down beasts, they pursued me relentlessly, and whenever the opportunity presented itself, I picked off any Tier 3 who wandered too far from the main group before slipping away from the Tier 4 fighter each time. By that point, exhaustion had caught up with me completely, and I decided my best option was heading for the Star City official supply stronghold. It was a risk, but I figured I had no real choice but to rest there for the night, reasoning that my pursuers wouldn't be reckless enough to attack me directly on official territory. Still, as I stepped inside, I could feel eyes watching me from somewhere nearby, and it only confirmed what I already suspected. Yachi was behind all of this. I checked into a hotel within a temporary supply stronghold. Opening my system, I reviewed my status interface and found my vitality sitting at 705 points, still far below the 900 required to reach Tier 2 high stage. So knowing a minor increase wouldn't give me much benefit right now, I decided to invest instead in strengthening my overlord body, boosting both endurance and raw combat power. My spirit rank only climbed from 1.1% to 6.5%. But my raw physical strength jumped by at least 20% in return. I spent the next stretch quietly cultivating my guiding technique, resting my eyes while staying fully ready to leap straight out the window if anything dangerous showed up. A few hours later, heading downstairs to the dining area, I completely lost my appetite mid-meal when a man wearing nothing but his underwear casually strolled past my table. As time passed without any sign of my stalkers, I started wondering if they were simply too cautious to move inside the protected stronghold, likely planning instead to ambush me the moment I stepped back outside. My thoughts were interrupted by a hunter nearby, loudly complaining that a ruthless group of Tier 4 martial artists had recently robbed his squad of a precious 3-star pattern dark purple bamboo. Apparently, this was a highly coveted natural treasure on par with an A-ranks resource, with even a basic 1-star version holding 2 separate attributes of spiritual chi. A legendary 3-star specimen could hold 4 elements at once, which would make it invaluable for anyone attempting a 4-attribute fusion, myself included. I cut into the conversation, pointing out that pulling a treasure like that from its original location was notoriously difficult, given the strange magnetic field laws surrounding it. The hunter, clearly impressed I knew that, explained that an extremely powerful gravity field guarded the plant, warning that the higher a martial artist's tier, the more crushing that force became. He laughed, recounting how the arrogant Tier 4 fighters who'd robbed his team had been instantly flattened into paste the moment they carelessly rushed in. That got me wondering whether my own newly upgraded overlord body could actually withstand that kind of gravitational pressure. Just then, a massive blood-red energy tore straight through the reinforced hotel wall. The strike sliced clean through my wooden dining table, though I simply leaned back with my food still in hand, fully aware my persistent hunters had finally caught up to me. The heavy-set assassin leader and his fully masked squad stepped through the smoking rubble, mocking me for not running this time. Nearby, the local hunters, terrified, whispered among themselves, baffled by what kind of trouble a kid my age could have stirred up to attract a Tier 4 expert along with over a dozen Tier 3 assassins. The assassin leader coldly ordered everyone else out of the area. Surrounding me completely, the heavily armed killers asked if I'd really believed they wouldn't dare strike inside a protected stronghold. I smirked and asked calmly whether they'd actually believe me if I told them I'd been waiting right here for them all along. The leader burst out laughing, mocking the idea that I genuinely thought I could wipe out his entire group single-handedly. I gripped my spear tightly, a violent aura of fire and crackling lightning curling around the weapon, and told him there was really only one way to find out. Seeing me wielding 3 distinct attributes at once, the assassin leader panicked, screaming for his men to scatter and pull back immediately. The warning came far too late. I flashed straight into the center of their formation and commanded the gathered elemental energy to explode outward in every direction. The entire hotel erupted into a colossal pillar of blinding light and raging fire, lighting up the night sky for miles around. Terrified witnesses nearby couldn't understand why such an overwhelming display of power was needed just to kill what looked like an ordinary Tier 2 martial artist. As the smoke slowly thinned, onlookers watched the masked assassins drop lifelessly across the shattered ground, one after another. A massive smoking crater now sat where the hotel used to stand, and the wounded assassin leader coughed violently amid the rubble, demanding to know why the intelligence they'd been given never mentioned I could handle 3 attributes. Bleeding heavily despite being a Tier 4 expert himself, he assumed I had to be dead. He let out a relieved sigh, reasoning that even with the heavy losses among his men, the mission could still technically be counted as complete. A concentrated burst of pure energy erupted from the crater's center, and he stared, wide-eyed, as I dropped down from directly above, already mid-strike with my spear. He barely managed to deflect it, screaming that I was still alive. I vanished from his line of sight almost immediately afterward, realizing he'd been baited completely. Just then, I appeared quietly behind one of his dazed, badly wounded grunts, who weakly turned to ask his boss what he was saying. I drove my spear straight through his chest without hesitation. Taking down a powerful Tier 4 fighter outright was still beyond me at this stage, but picking off his weaker Tier 3 subordinates was well within reach. The raw, unstable force of a failed 3-attribute fusion was genuinely terrifying, and without the protective, thick earth armor I'd condensed in time, paired with my recently upgraded overlord body, I would have been permanently crippled even if I'd somehow survived the blast. I worked through the remaining grunts methodically, leaving the assassin's Tier 3 forces almost entirely wiped out. If I could just manage to stabilize a successful 3-attribute fusion, I genuinely believed I'd have a real shot at taking down the Tier 4 boss himself. Enraged, the assassin leader flared a massive, murderous red aura, vowing to tear my corpse into 10,000 pieces. Back at the Star City martial artist base, Lin Xinghe was preparing for a trip, having originally hoped to invite me along to Stargazing Lake, only to learn I'd already left a week earlier. Tanwo and Xiaoyan joined the conversation, pointing out that while the 3 of them had spent a full 7 days recovering, I'd apparently rested for only a single day before heading straight back into training. Conceding that comparing themselves to someone like me was pointless, the trio set off anyway, hoping to cross paths with me somewhere near the lake. Meanwhile, a furious Yachi smashed a cup in his office, cursing his men as a bunch of failures. He raged that the assassins hadn't just impersonated martial artists from the base, they'd also locked down the area around Stargazing Lake and openly attacked me at the supply stronghold itself. If I ended up dead, suspicion would land on him without question, and given how much the city lord valued me, retaliation would likely mean the destruction of his entire clan. Far from the city, deep within the dark purple bamboo forest, a crushing purple dome known as the mysterious gravity field guarded the area. Hunters attempting to reach the treasure lay groaning on the ground around its edge. Nearby onlookers did the math, estimating that for someone weighing around 80 kilograms, 30 times gravity amounted to a crushing load of just over 2 tons. Another nearby explained that this wasn't like carrying a heavy object at all. Every single cell in the body had to endure 30 times normal gravity. Just then, the rogue elite leader and his followers arrived at the edge of the field. He explained that the higher a martial artist's cultivation, the heavier the gravity the field would impose on them, meaning a Tier 4 fighter walking in would face several times the pressure a Tier 3 would. Concluding the 3-star pattern dark purple bamboo was out of reach for now, he turned away to continue his search for some other divine object instead. Almost immediately, his compass spun rapidly and stopped dead, revealing that what he'd actually been searching for this whole time was hidden inside that very bamboo. He stood there, trying to figure out how he was supposed to retrieve it, when he spotted me leaping through the trees nearby. He looked baffled, wondering what I was even doing here, and more importantly, how a Tier 4 expert leading a squad of Tier 3s had somehow failed to kill a mere Tier 2 brat. Calling them all a bunch of failures, he decided to finish the job himself, reasoning that with the reward dropped practically at his door, there was no point passing it up. Sensing a powerful aura closing in, I braced myself, barely getting the chance to react before he lunged. Knowing a simple dodge wouldn't cut it, I summoned my thick earth armor and met his attack head-on with a burst of energy. As the dust settled, we both stood our ground. Once my armor dissolved, I caught my breath, genuinely impressed he'd managed to withstand my strike at all. He declared I'd die that day and lunged again. In the middle of his threats, I recognized him. A demonic cultist who somehow already knew my name, which meant the cult, not just Yachi, also wanted me dead. I gathered my energy and charged straight at him. The collision triggered a violent explosion that sent him flying back through the trees. Coughing up blood, he stared at me in disbelief, demanding to know how a Tier 2 martial artist could unleash power like that. Seeing me on the move, he ordered his squad to stop me, leaving me boxed in, cultists ahead and a Tier 4 fighter behind. Cultists actually considered triggering their mutated transformation again, foolishly assuming I couldn't repeat the technique a second time. One of them ordered the group to throw everything they had at me, but I cut him down instantly. Before the rest could even react, I tore through the entire group in one continuous strike. The survivors panicked, asking each other how they could have possibly believed I wouldn't use it again. Desperate, they decided to charge together regardless. I answered with treading sea, sweeping my spear in a wide arc that incinerated the attackers outright. The robe leader seized the opening and leapt into the air, daring me to block his next strike. Instead of meeting a full-powered Tier 4 attack head-on, I used Flying Swan Startling Cloud Step to leap straight into the gravity field. Onlookers gasped, watching me cover over 10 paces inside the field in an instant. Furious, the cultist screamed that hiding in the field wouldn't save me and stepped into the dome himself to give chase, only for the gravity to spike toward 30 times the moment his foot touched down. A clear sign that pushing any deeper as a Tier 4 would mean facing pressure in the hundreds. Stuck at the border, he cursed and hurled a spear at me instead, but the weapon grew impossibly heavy mid-flight and dropped harmlessly to the ground before it could reach me. He shouted for me to come out if I had any nerve. I figured I was reasonably safe for the moment, and with the 3-star patterned dark purple bamboo finally in sight, I pushed forward. The closer I got though, the heavier the gravity became. Since the cult couldn't follow me in regardless, I decided to sit down first and use a healing technique to patch myself up. The watching hunters were baffled, struggling to understand how I could switch from a thunder attribute straight into a wood attribute healing technique. Watching me heal, the cult leader ordered his men to summon Lin Chan and the others to join forces and finish me off, certain now that the divine object had to be hidden inside that bamboo. Meanwhile, near Stargazing Lake, Tanwo, Xiaoyan, and Lin Xingye stumbled across the body of a dead demonic cultist. Realizing the cult had locked down the entire region and likely had me as their target, they immediately turned back toward the martial artist base to alert the authorities. On the way, the complete silence at the base only deepened their suspicion that it might be colluding with the cultists. At his estate, Wang Ni received the alarming report and, confirming the cult was indeed hunting me, immediately began preparing a rescue team to head for the lake himself. Meanwhile, at the edge of the crushing gravity field, the robed cult leader and his followers waited as the battered assassin boss arrived. The assassin boss explained that my tactics had caused heavy casualties, wiping out nearly all of his Tier 3 men. Furious, the assassin boss explained that I'd unleashed a 3-attribute fusion technique that hadn't been included in their original intel, leaving the leader skeptical, since he'd always considered that level of power little more than a myth. Still, the evidence in front of him made it clear I really did possess 3 attributes. Knowing full well that failing to kill me would mean their own execution, 2 hours later, I finished, having fully restored my health and spiritual chi, exactly as expected from an A-rank healing technique. Noticing the cult had no intention of giving up their vigil, I knew they wouldn't stop until I was dead, which meant I'd need to grab the treasure and escape immediately afterward. Taking my first steps toward it, I felt the gravity field intensify sharply again. Outside the barrier, the leader and the assassin boss watched in disbelief as I closed the distance, pointing out that I was now only 5 or 6 steps from the bamboo. The leader devised a plan on the spot, reasoning that the moment I pulled the treasure free, the gravity field's rules would collapse entirely. He ordered his men to rush in the second that happened. Pushing past what felt like my absolute limit, exhausted and gasping, I finally reached the bamboo. Before harvesting it though, something caught my eye. The crushing gravity around me was grinding solid stone into powder, yet a strange black fragment lying nearby showed no deformation whatsoever. Suspecting it might be some kind of treasure itself, I picked it up, I turned it over, unable to identify the material or anything unusual about it, and tested its durability with everything I had, but it wouldn't even bend. In the process, the sharp edge cut into my hand, and before I could react, the fragment liquefied and seeped straight into the wound. A colossal surge of energy erupted inside me, all 7 types of spiritual chi suddenly churning violently, and a system notification informed me I'd obtained a fragment of something called the 7 Gods Cauldron. Recognizing this could push my cultivation forward significantly, I sat down immediately and began absorbing it. Outside, the cultists looked utterly confused, questioning what I could have possibly picked up to suddenly drop into meditation. To my own surprise, my spiritual chi surged by more than tenfold. Techniques that used to drain me after a single use, I could now cast dozens of times in a row. On top of that, the 3-attribute fusion that had eluded me for so long finally locked into place without resistance. Checking my system afterward, my vitality sat at 707.5, my spirit at 5 on 1, and the item itself was logged as 1 out of 100, meaning 99 more fragments existed somewhere out there. If a single fragment had boosted my strength this dramatically, the 7 Gods Cauldron itself had to rank well above S rank, and I found myself genuinely curious how strong I'd become if I ever managed to collect the rest. With this much spiritual chi behind me now, I had no real reason to keep running. Seeing me move to act, the cult leader shouted that I was about to pull the bamboo free, ordering everyone to prepare to strike. I gripped the dark purple bamboo and tore it free in one motion, and the instant I did, the gravity field collapsed entirely. The leader ordered his men to charge and finish me off. I just scoffed, deciding to let them feel the full force of my 3-attribute fusion firsthand. The charging cultists froze, visibly shaken by the sheer power radiating off the weapon, and I let the gathered energy detonate outward, unleashing a massive elemental blast that swept across the entire area. Their screams tore through the air. The sheer force of the explosion was absurd enough to reshape the surrounding landscape entirely, leaving a trail of total devastation behind. As the smoke and dust settled, charred remains were scattered across the area. The badly injured assassin boss barely managed to pull himself out of the rubble, coughing blood as he tried to process what had just happened, while the wounded cult leader put the pieces together. Realizing I must have gotten my hands on a fragment of the divine object, I dropped down right in front of them, my aura still radiating off me, and asked the 2 of them with a smirk if they'd had fun hunting me. I gave them a simple choice: reveal the location of the myriad races demon cult's secret stronghold somewhere in Star City. Realizing they'd colluded with Ye Chi at the base to assemble this many fighters in such a short window, became clear the cult had to have been entrenched in the city for a long time already. The assassin boss warned me not to get too confident, swearing he'd drag me down to hell with him even in death. That was when the cult leader hurled a flashbang and screamed for them to retreat, the blinding distraction giving them just enough cover to vanish into the smoke. Once the threat had cleared, I collapsed to the ground completely spent. That last attack had drained nearly every drop of my thunder, fire, and metal chi, and I realized, somewhat uneasily, that going up against 2 Tier 4 fighters fighting for their lives might genuinely have been beyond me. Running on fumes, I activated my healing technique immediately to start recovering, already set on hunting down Ye Chi for revenge the first chance I got. Dozens of kilometers away, the 2 injured leaders fled through the woods. The assassin boss pointed out that I hadn't bothered chasing them, reasoning that the terrifying technique I'd unleashed had probably drained me completely, meaning it had all just been a bluff. The cult leader wasn't so sure, reminding him that monsters on my level rarely followed common logic. The assassin boss argued that no matter how monstrous I might be, I was still only Tier 2 against the 2 of them at Tier 4. The leader told him to drop it, pointing out that both their teams had been wiped out entirely, a single Tier 2 fighter having turned 2 Tier 4 commanders into men without an army. It was the kind of story no one would believe, each new genius seeming more absurd than the last. Back at the martial artist base, Yachi paced his office anxiously, waiting for word, aware that maintaining this blockade much longer would inevitably draw the city lord's attention. A message flashed across the stone in his hand, confirming the operation against me had failed. He shouted in disbelief, unable to accept they couldn't even kill a Tier 2 martial artist, already panicking that if I survived, the truth behind everything would surface and the city lord would show him no mercy. He rushed for his vehicle, cursing my name, certain none of this would have happened if not for me. Just then, a flame cage erupted around him, trapping him in place. I stepped out of the shadows and asked him exactly where he thought he was going. He turned, mocking the very idea that a Tier 2 martial artist could kill him, a Tier 3 peak expert, and lunged at me with a fiery palm strike. I dodged it in a flash of speed and told him calmly that the outcome was still very much up for debate. I drove my spear straight through his chest, and his final word as he gasped was "monster." The impact sent his body crashing back into his own car, the vehicle erupting into a massive fireball. I stood there calmly afterward, while the surrounding martial artists, stunned by the public execution playing out in broad daylight, identified the victim as Ya Qi. Moments later, a fleet of official cars rolled in, and Wang Ni stepped out, carrying himself with full authority. Watching the scene, the onlookers chose to vouch for me, arguing plainly that Ya Qi had deserved exactly what he got for trying to ambush me in the first place. To everyone's surprise, the city lord completely ignored the burning car and rushed straight to me, calling me a precious treasure and asking if I was hurt anywhere. As he shook me almost too vigorously, he caught sight of the 3-star pattern dark purple bamboo in my hand and declared that my luck had to be heaven-defying, leaving me deeply uncomfortable with how affectionate he was being. He eventually turned his attention to the burning car and Ye Qi's body, asking me to walk him through exactly what had happened. Over 10 minutes later, inside his car, I finished explaining everything, and he worked to get the full picture straight. Bakulta colluded with Ye Qi to send 2 Tier 4 fighters and nearly 30 Tier 3s after me, and somehow I'd survived 8 days on the run, killing or critically wounding every single Tier 3 assassin involved, while also leaving both Tier 4 leaders badly injured and walking away with the dark purple bamboo in hand. I simply told him that was more or less how it went. Overjoyed, he grabbed me and asked, half-jokingly, if I'd be interested in marrying all 40-something of his daughters so the family could mass-produce monster geniuses to help save the human race. Mortified, I told him to please stop joking. I pointed out that whoever was actually running the cult could still be hiding somewhere in the city, meaning the next attackers might be Tier 6 or even Tier 7 Grand Masters, a threat level the city simply couldn't protect me from anymore. With the college entrance exam only a month away, my best option was clearly enrolling at either Magic City University or Imperial Capital University, places where even Grandmasters wouldn't be able to touch me. Confident, I told him I'd definitely get in. Sometime later, as he dropped me off at home, he promised to send 2 teams of martial artists to patrol the villa so I could cultivate without worrying about safety. Walking inside, my aunt and uncle panicked at the sight of all the blood on me, urging me to get to a hospital immediately, but I reassured them it belonged to beasts, not me, and that there was nothing to worry about. Alone in my room, I reviewed my stats and found I'd accumulated another 3,100 martial Dao points from the fighting in the forest. Pouring everything into vitality would push me past the 1,000-point threshold and let me break through to Tier 3, but doing so would leave my spiritual power neglected, still sitting barely at Tier 2. Unable to safely leave the city while assassination attempts were still a threat, I knew I'd be facing a long stretch of stagnation either way. I decided to split the investment, raising both spiritual power and vitality together, tapping through my interface to push both stats up simultaneously. I tested the results by lifting a glass of water off the desk, then making the liquid swirl and dance freely around the room. The next day at Star City No. 1 High School, students were already buzzing, gossiping about how I'd been surrounded by 100 attackers and taken every one of them down in a flash. Meanwhile, Chen Shan and Li Tu were going classroom to classroom recounting their own training camp exploits, prompting one irritated student to ask why they'd shown up in Class 8 instead of Class 7, reminding them his own class had been waiting an entire week for their turn. Mid-conversation, a student near the window suddenly shouted that I'd arrived at school. Walking through the gates, I was met with a wave of students charging straight at me, screaming for me not to run. Genuinely thrown off, I broke into a cold sweat. Within moments, a massive crowd had swallowed me whole, all of them begging to hear about everything I'd done. My classmate, laughing, started bragging loudly about how dumbfounded our teacher had been after hearing the news, and I coughed pointedly, trying to get him to stop. He ignored me completely, still laughing, teasing me about catching a cold, with no idea that Teacher Lee was standing right behind us the entire time. Teacher Lee grabbed the kid by the head without warning, and the terrified student asked why he was even there, only for Lee to mockingly ask why he'd suddenly stopped calling him Old Lee. After catching the kid, who'd been trash-talking, Teacher Lee told me the principal was waiting for me. When I knocked on the office door and announced myself, the principal, Li Chengshan, practically burst out of his seat, welcoming me enthusiastically and calling me the great treasure of Star City. Once we sat down, I asked why he wanted to see me. He pulled out a few low and mid-stage pills, trying to slip them to me privately, insisting I take them, But I politely turned him down, mentioning casually that I probably didn't need them since I'd already reached the high stage. Lower grade resources wouldn't do much for me at this point, and I suggested he give them to someone who actually needed them more. He sat there completely dumbfounded, struggling to comprehend how I'd reached that level so fast after entering the camp at the initial stage. I explained that some things had come up recently and pushed my growth along faster than expected. Excited by the news, he insisted we head straight to the gymnasium to test my strength, promising to teach me a few moves himself. I pointed out somewhat awkwardly that my actual mentor was a tier 3 fighter. He brushed it off, promising to hold back.
Yeah, boy.
As we walked into the gym, students immediately recognized me, asking if I was really the one who'd fought off 100 attackers single-handedly. The principal proudly announced he'd be sparring with me himself, ordering any free students to gather and watch closely. I felt genuinely uncomfortable and asked if we could move somewhere else, but he misread my hesitation entirely, laughing it off and assuring me he wouldn't make me look too bad. My real concern was the opposite, that if he ended up losing, it would damage his standing as principal. With no real way to back out, he stepped onto the court and told me to make the first move. The students cheered, eager to see me take on a tier 3 martial artist. To avoid actually hurting him, I decided to use something modest enough not to make my restraint obvious, settling on the B-rank cloud-hiding Gale fist and charged forward. He looked startled, assuming I was being a little too forward-opening with a technique that high grade. Realizing almost immediately that the power behind it rivaled tier 3 output, he gathered rock energy and formed his giant rock fist to counter. The two attacks collided violently in the center of the court, sending a shockwave rippling outward. The students, struggling just to keep their eyes open against the force of it, retreated a rapid flurry of blows until the collision finally sent us both sliding backward. He looked down in shock, his stone armor shattered from the impact, and the students gasped, realizing I hadn't even used my full strength yet. Behind his calm exterior, he was quietly panicking, having already burned through 80% of his own strength, terrified of being publicly humiliated by his own student. Sensing his distress, I dropped to one knee and conceded defeat outright, praising his strength, privately hoping he'd understand exactly what I was doing. At first, he looked confused by the sudden surrender, but the moment it clicked, he seemed genuinely moved, appreciating the gesture and how quickly I'd thought to spare him the embarrassment. He turned to the crowd and declared that I was indeed the school's most outstanding student, possessing strength comparable to a tier 3 high-stage fighter despite only being tier 2 myself. The gym erupted in cheers, students already speculating whether Star City might finally produce someone admitted into a proper martial university. As he helped me up, he quietly thanked me, admitting he'd nearly embarrassed himself out there. I took the opening to ask if he'd help me break through to tier 3 before the college entrance exam, just a month away. Surprised by the request, he agreed anyway. From there, I settled into a routine, sparring with him during the day and cultivating my guiding techniques at home each night. Before long, my stamina ran the principal completely dry, forcing the old man to call in his old comrade, Chen Tian, to take over the sparring sessions so he could rest for a day. Within a few weeks, both Li Chengshan and Chen Tian looked thoroughly hollowed out themselves. Eventually, they reached out to Wu Lingshen and handed me off to her care entirely. Wu Lingxian, a tier 5 martial artist, fought without holding anything back. She stood over me after I'd been knocked down again, telling me there was no resting and to keep going. A month passed that way, and with only 5 days left before the exam, I told her, battered and exhausted, that I could feel a breakthrough approaching. She asked if I was just trying to wriggle out of training, but I told her plainly that this wasn't an excuse. I genuinely sensed it coming. When she pressed further, asking if the feeling was real, I nodded and she stood there stunned, demanding to know whether my vitality had really jumped from 900 to 1,000 in under a month. Once I confirmed it, she immediately ordered 2 bottles of tier 3 advancement pills delivered straight to the training room, telling me I could attempt the breakthrough right there on the spot. As she left the room, I sat cross-legged, letting my injuries heal as I gathered my energy, finally ready to push through to tier 3. Down on the first floor of the Martial Dao Association, Wu Linshen hummed cheerfully as she skipped through the hallway. Lost in her own thoughts, she was already imagining the flood of resources the province would funnel toward the local association the moment I broke through to tier 3, practically celebrating on the spot. The staff, baffled by the sudden shift in her usually serious demeanor, started whispering among themselves, joking that their stern president must finally be in love, wondering who on earth would be brave enough to date someone as tomboyish as her. When Li Chengshan and Chen Tian showed up looking for her in the backyard, the gossiping staff hilariously assumed she was juggling both old men at once. Meanwhile, deep in the training room, I pushed through the breakthrough attempt, a fiery red aura flaring around me as raw energy surged violently through my body, straining every part of me. My first attempt ended in failure, leaving me exhausted and gasping for breath. Refusing to give up, I channeled the gratitude I felt toward everyone who trained me into fresh resolve and ignited my aura for a second attempt. After half an hour of relentless pain, I finally managed to tame the violent energy, compressing the berserk vitality deep inside my body before forcing one final push against the barrier. It broke, the resulting explosion of raw strength shredding the clothes right off my body. Once the dust settled, I sat there in awe of the upgrades coursing through my physical stats, fully experiencing Tier 3 for the first time. To test the new limits, I fired off a vitality externalization punch, sending a massive blast of pure energy shooting clean across the room. Unlike anyone below Tier 3 who needed an actual martial art to launch a ranged attack, a Tier 3 fighter could simply will energy outward at will. My system confirmed it. Vitality at a full 1,000 points. Thrilled, I got up to go share the news with Wu, completely forgetting I was still standing there without a stitch of clothing on. Before I could even reach the door, it swung open, and Wu asked if I was trying to start some kind of indecency scandal, while Li Chengshan and Chen Tian stood behind her, already snapping photos. Mortified, I curled up on the floor while Wu called the city lord to share the news, joking that they might need to hold a parent-teacher meeting on my behalf. Meanwhile, over at the city lord's manor, Tanhwa burst into his father's room, proudly announcing that he'd broken through to Tier 2 middle stage. Expecting praise, he was instead met with barely any reaction at all. Frustrated by the lukewarm response, he pointed out that he was only 18 and had already pulled off a Tier 2 middle stage breakthrough. Without responding, Wang Ni grabbed his coat and bolted for the door, explaining on his way out that Wu had just called to tell him I'd broken through to Tier 3. Soon after, the city's top leaders gathered at the Martial Dao Association, all of them staring at me, looking thoroughly awkward. Getting straight to business, Wang Ni handed me a secret folder, warning me to stay alert for several high-level martial artists who'd recently passed through Star City, telling me that simply keeping track of these names would help keep me safe. Flipping through the pages, I frowned at nearly 100 unfamiliar names, including Grandmaster Chen Budu, the Lin family of the imperial capital, and Wang Dao of Magic City's own Wang family. When I admitted I didn't recognize a single one of them, Wang Ni explained that even among the higher ranks of the human race, traitors existed. People willing to do anything to eliminate a genius like me. With those stakes suddenly raised, I realized that while I'd already braced myself to be hunted by the myriad races, I'd never accounted for the possibility of human traitors coming after me too. Wu told me not to worry, explaining that once I enrolled at Magic City Martial Artist University, none of those traitors would dare lay a hand on me. I asked if that meant Imperial Capital's university wasn't safe. She explained that students there were almost universally wealthy or noble, the kind of place where throwing a brick blindly would almost certainly hit someone descended from one of the top 100 families or heir to a Tier 8 powerhouse. Without that kind of backing myself, they simply wouldn't value me there. Wang Ni and Li Chengshan both admitted, somewhat embarrassed, that they hadn't properly considered the social hierarchy of these schools before suggesting either option earlier. Wu added that Magic City's university, by contrast, was fully merit-based, caring only about raw talent and strength, meaning no one there would have any institutional motive to suppress me. Convinced, I happily settled on Magic City as my choice. Wang Ni warned that while the school's overall culture leaned wild, its principal was fiercely protective of his students. When I claimed I never went out of my way to start trouble, my mentors all just stared at me blankly, asking who exactly had killed Yachi at the martial artist base and taken down dozens of demon cult assassins. Li Chengshan and Chen Tian chimed in too, pointing out that I'd also gone toe-to-toe with 6 different training camps and personally defeated every student in mine, leaving me laughing nervously, unable to really argue the point. Changing the subject quickly, Wang Ni pointed at my outfit and gently asked if my taste in clothing was a little unusual. Wu spoke up proudly, insisting her taste was excellent and explaining she'd lent me her own clothes since mine had been destroyed by my surging vitality. Not wanting to offend her, Wang Ni lied through his teeth, praising the outfit, while I thanked them both awkwardly. A few days later at the Star City airport, the city lord personally welcomed the official college entrance examiner, a sharp Tier 5 martial artist named Wang Lindo. As they shook hands, the examiner mentioned that his own teacher had abruptly ordered him to come oversee the exam in Star City, even instructing him to set aside his usual pride and actively befriend any talented students he encountered. Wang Lindo grumbled that as a Tier 5 martial artist, lowering himself to court favor with some student felt beneath him, especially given that Star City hadn't produced a single Tier 2 examinee in years. Wang Ni asked if an 18-year-old Tier 3 genius might change his mind. The examiner froze, then immediately demanded to know exactly where the student was so he could see for himself. At the exam venue, officials busied themselves setting up the vitality and combat power testers ahead of the big day. Wog checking her phone anxiously, waiting for the examiner to return with me in tow. Sensing her worry, Wang Ni pointed into the crowd, revealing exactly where I'd ended up. It turned out the examiner had completely abandoned his dignity, throwing an arm around me to force a selfie, practically begging me to smile for the camera. Watching the spectacle, both Wu and Wang Ni cringed in disbelief at how shameless he was being. Shortly after, the speakers crackled to life, officially kicking off the Martial Dao assessment. The announcer explained the process would follow the usual format, starting with a vitality test, and that students at Tier 2 and above would need to take a special train to the provincial capital for centralized testing, while everyone below Tier 2 would continue local testing for combat power and other categories. I grumbled that absolutely no one had bothered mentioning this travel requirement to me, which only got Li Changshan, Wu, and Lin laughing awkwardly, admitting they'd simply forgotten. While we talked, Lin Jingge, Tenwo, and Xiao Yan caught up nearby. Lin Xingsha asked Tenwo if he'd finally surpassed me, congratulating him on reaching Tier 2 middle stage, but Tanwa only said they'd find out soon enough, while Xiaoyan complained he was just stalling for suspense. Together, they watched the crowd gathered around, all curious to see exactly what tier I'd landed at. People speculated openly about whether I'd reached Tier 2 middle stage, with one onlooker betting I'd already pushed into high stage. I started my test and unleashed a massive, terrifying surge of red energy. Lin Jing and Xiao Yan broke into a cold sweat, struggling to process what they were seeing. The machine rang up a score of 105, confirming I'd already reached Tier 3. He just laughed, admitting they'd never catch up to me in this lifetime. The entire stadium erupted into chaos over the result, the crowd buzzing that a Tier 3 examinee had never once appeared in Star City's history, already drawing comparisons between my strength and that of the principal himself. Seizing the moment, Lin Tu, my classmate, proudly bragged to the crowd that he was my close friend and personal sparring partner. Up in the VIP room, Lin Xinghe and Xiao Yan's fathers were losing their minds. Lin Xingxi's father lamented, half-joking, that he wished his son had been born a daughter, while Xiao Yan's father immediately resolved to dress his own daughter up to try to lock me in as a future son-in-law. On the main stage, Wang Ni and Wu traded smug, satisfied glances, thrilled that my rise was about to push both the city and their association to heights neither had ever reached before. Watching from the crowd, examiner Wang Lindo, a seasoned official used to overseeing exams across the entire province, knew firsthand how rare it was for a low-ranked city like Star City to produce even a single Tier 2 student. Given the enormous gap in cultivation resources between small cities and the major ones, my growth into a Tier 3 martial artist under these resource-starved conditions struck him as genuinely terrifying. He couldn't help thinking that with the kind of elite training available in Magic City or the Imperial Capital, I'd probably already be Tier 4, cementing me, in his mind, as the most remarkable talent he'd ever personally witnessed. Back on the field, the crowd had already started cheering loudly, leaving me thoroughly uncomfortable under the sudden spotlight. With local testing finished, only Star City's top performers, myself along with Tanwell, Xiao Yan, and Lin Xinghe, moved forward to the next phase. After packing our things, the four of us boarded the special high-speed train bound for the provincial capital. Walking down the aisle, the other candidates already seated tried to stare us down, flaring their auras aggressively to intimidate the newcomers. Lin Xing scoffed at the obvious posturing, while Xiao Yan readied her telekinesis to push back if needed. Before either of them could act, I stepped forward instead, deciding the crowd deserved a proper demonstration of real strength. My eyes lit up, and a towering pillar of blue energy erupted around me, taking the shape of a colossal roaring dragon. The pressure swept through the cabin instantly, crushing and neutralizing every hostile aura in the room in a single wave. The once arrogant candidates broke into a cold sweat, horrified to learn that a rural place like Star City had actually produced a genuine Tier 3 martial artist. Even Tanwo and the others were left speechless, recognizing that the pressure alone rivaled Tier 3 middle stage output. I walked calmly down the aisle, telling them plainly that this was what happened when people picked fights without even bothering to introduce themselves first. The cowed candidates sat frozen in their seats, quietly deciding that if they ever crossed paths with me during the actual assessment, running immediately would be their best option. As the train sped toward the capital, Lin Xingyi asked which university I planned to test for, Magic City or the Imperial Capital. I turned the question back on them, and he declared that all three of them were aiming for Magic City Martial Artist University. I smiled and told them I'd already settled on the same school myself, adding that once we eventually reached the myriad heavens battlefield together, we'd be standing as comrades in arms. Lin Xing laughed, admitting that having me as a teammate put his mind completely at ease, while Tanwo jokingly warned him to stay sharp regardless, since Magic City's university was notorious for expelling anyone who slacked off. As the conversation settled, I found myself genuinely looking forward to what awaited me at Magic City Martial Artist University. Soon after, geniuses from other cities began boarding the train. Lin Jing was surprised I already knew him, and I explained I'd sparred at his camp before. More people followed, several of them also looking for rematches, and one large guy announced that he'd finally get his chance at revenge. Student after student filed in after him, and the others on the train started wondering what was wrong, confused by why so many of the best geniuses from across the province all seemed to have a bone to pick specifically with me. Lin Xing found the whole thing ridiculous and asked what exactly the Grandmasters had put me through out there. Xiao Yan asked directly if I'd actually beaten up the entirety of Jiangnan's training camps. I deflected the questions smoothly and moved on. After a while, we arrived at Hang City, the provincial capital of Jiangnan Province. At the center of Heavenly Star Plaza stood a rift guarded by cultivators, and the gathered crowd murmured that it had to be the Heavenly Star's secret realm for this year's martial arts examination. Word spread that the realm contained a large number of rare treasures, and people couldn't help wondering how a martial arts exam had essentially turned into a prize distribution event. The trio I'd rescued from the demon cult's sacrificial altar was already there waiting, having come out specifically to greet me. Just then, a car pulled up, and the young man stepped out, immediately drawing murmurs from the crowd. He was apparently the #1 genius of Wencheng City, Chen Tianyan, taking the lead for his group. He and his crew walked toward the gathered crowd, and he released his aura, calling out to Chen Su, Klong Lei, and Luo Dao. The crowd froze the moment his Tier 3 cultivation became apparent. The trio from his group released their own auras in response, questioning what exactly he was trying to show off. Chen Tian seemed amused, declaring that once everyone entered the realm, he'd wipe them all out. The trio told him plainly that if he thought he could take on 3 of them at once, he should keep a low profile and make sure I didn't notice him. He immediately mocked them, saying he'd heard of me, dismissing me as some Tier 2 nobody from a trash city like Star City. The crowd laughed, though they made no move to correct him. One of them pointed out casually that the very person he was talking about had just stepped off the bus, and the others nudged him toward me. I stepped out alongside the other 3, and someone pointed the man in my direction. I looked over casually and spotted my next target doing some kind of dramatic gesture that reminded me of a chicken doing a dance. My teammates were already wondering whether he was about to join my growing collection of beaten opponents, though I genuinely couldn't remember his face from anywhere. From above, a voice asked if I was the one making such a fuss. It was Lin Bakeson, a Tier 7 Grandmaster, telling my master I looked unremarkable, wondering why he'd been praising me so highly. My master corrected him, mentioning my 100% compatibility across all 7 attributes and my ability to fuse them. Lin Bakeson seemed like the kind of person who needed to see things for himself before believing them. The crowd began getting restless, wondering aloud why it hadn't started yet since everyone had arrived. Lin Bakeson told everyone to quiet down and released his aura, the pressure washing over the entire plaza, and even I, having felt overwhelming power countless times before, still found it genuinely shocking. He introduced himself as the one who would be announcing the assessment rolls. The first phase would take place inside the Heavenly Star secret realm over 7 days, with points awarded for killing beasts. Second, map fragments were hidden inside certain beasts, and these maps would lead to the locations of special ferocious creatures worth massive points when killed. Third, at the center of the realm lived a Tier 4 initial stage barbarian dragon, and killing it would reward 10,000 points. Hearing Tier 4 lit me up immediately. Tanbo leaned over and mentioned the creature carried dragon bloodline, putting its actual combat power likely at Tier 4 middle stage levels. Then Bakeson continued with the 4th rule. Defeating other candidates allowed the winner to plunder half their points. Hearing that, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. A bracelet then materialized in front of every participant, which Lin Bakeson explained would display the live points leaderboard, meaning whoever sat at the top would automatically become the biggest target in the realm. With that, he officially declared the Jiangnan Province Martial Arts Examination open and activated the Heavenly Star secret realm. The more eager geniuses launched themselves inside immediately, with the rest of the crowd following right after. Lin Jingji told me to hurry up, but I told him to go ahead first. Xiao Yan, floating the other 2 with her powers, gave me a look, fully aware I was just planning to hang back and rob other people's accumulated points on my way through. She wasn't entirely wrong. Killing beasts alone earned decent points, but nowhere near as efficiently as beating people and taking half of theirs. My master called me over for a cup of coffee instead, and I sat beside him like an obedient student. Lin Basin remarked plainly that the two of us were simply full of bad intentions. I told him I hadn't broken any rules yet. Looking at me curiously, he mentioned there were other Tier 3 candidates in the realm, and asked why I looked so comfortable about it. I told him I was just a little confident, and my master jumped in, calling me modest, and told Lim Bakeson that not long ago I'd been targeted by demon cult assassins right in Star City, and over 7 days had killed over 30 Tier 3 fighters and badly wounded 2 Tier 4s. Min Bakeson looked skeptical, clearly doubting it, and I told my master he was exaggerating. That seemed to settle Lin Bakeson's skepticism, until I corrected myself, clarifying it had actually been 8 days, and that I'd put my life on the line the entire time to finish every last one of them.